Then for this meeting, what we're hoping to do is catch up some stuff that we've had two very good meetings so far. This is the third one, so we've collected some requests for a little bit more information, some more data. So we're providing what we have today, and I'll explain to you what we don't have today. Then we'll also pick up a presentation that we didn't have time for at the last meeting. Dean Brunson will give us a description, explanation of a piece of our analysis process that's pretty helpful to us in terms of looking at how different risks play against each other. So that's the Monte Carlo analysis. And then we'll discuss a plan for what we need to do to complete the IRP. Through this, the way we've designed IRP this time, we wanted to get some good analysis out early in the process for two reasons. One was to give a better foundation for public comment. We thought as we go through and work through the rest of the analysis that as a public advisory group member, hopefully you're better armed or understand the process better if we could illustrate the whole thing. So we did analysis and presented analysis on what replacement options for San Juan capacity looks like. But that's by no means all of IRP. We've talked about the portfolio between now and 2018. It's a 20-year planning horizon, so we need to build that out to where we're talking about over the whole 20 years. So anyway, we'll talk about what the plan is to accomplish the analysis that remains to be done and how we'll interact with each other through that process to, again, improve our planning through the public advisory process. And then finally, we'll just have a wrap-up discussion. I hope this will be a good opportunity just to pick up any comments or thoughts or ideas that you've built up over the three meetings here. And then I'm going to float a couple dates for our next meeting just so people can look at calendars and figure out which dates work. Okay, so moving forward to just safety and logistics for the meeting. Again, if you've been here before, I apologize, but if you haven't, this is important information. Again, somehow we've made it through IRP this far without a fire drill, but it usually happens. So when it does happen, we're in a new building, it's remodeled, so if you've been here for things before, you might not be that familiar. But the response when we get a fire drill is first, yes, we have to leave the room. Second, we'll go through the exit doors and fan out to the left and the right. There are stairwells near the men's and women's bathrooms. We go into the stairwell, we'll go downstairs, end up in a parking garage. We go through the parking garage to the west and safely cross the street and end up in the gathering space, which is a parking lot to the west of this building. And then again, if you need help to get out of the building, let us know and we'll make sure that happens. Just again, restrooms, if you need them, are through the doors, and men's room is to the left, women's room is to the right. You've already encountered this. You had to sign in the security desk coming in. Thank you for doing that. And then the security desk also asks that you sign out on your way out. And then something that, this is an example of how comments improve our process. I've been remiss in mentioning that we have recycling bins on this floor. P&M has recycling goals that we're trying to meet. So especially like these plastic water bottles, when you're done with them, there are special recycling bins that are fairly well marked and easy to find. So we ask that you throw them in the recycling bin instead of the garbage. And then just to review IRP meeting ground rules, again, we've had two very good meetings. I think this process has been working well. The goal of this meeting is, and all of our meetings, is to provide transparency into our planning process. And while we're providing transparency, we want your feedback. So welcome questions and comments in the meeting. The best way that those work is if we're just respectful of all our participants, and just one way that works is if we make sure our questions and comments are about the materials, not about any individuals. Another thing that works well is I'll be up here and Dean will be up here. You all have name tents in front of you. So when you've got a question, you can put the tent up, and when we get to a good stopping point, we'll stop and ask to hear the question. We'll repeat the question so the folks on the webinar can hear it, and then answer it to the best we can at the moment, or it'll create a comment that we know we need to follow up on. And I don't think I mentioned this at the second meeting, but at the first is, Susan Sponar of P&M is here, and so you've seen her typing away. What she's doing is creating a record of the comments we're receiving in the meeting. And Shane up here in the front of the room, he's administering the webinar. We have a few people that are participating in this meeting on the webinar. That's also helping us create a record of the dialogue and the comments so that we can go back and sift through it and make sure that we heard everything and that we're considering it in our planning process. And then finally, just a reminder that this presentation isn't our financial forecast. It's an illustration of our resource planning process. So that's kind of a SEC reminder. And again, slide 5 is the long version of my reminder. So we will have a quiz on this, by the way, at some point. Okay. Next step, again, this is maybe third time through for some of you, but we just like to remember, just as an agenda item, what our goals are going into IRP. What we're looking at is resource planning over a 20-year horizon. We, at P&M, our planning is ongoing, but every 3 years we have a more formal process where we try to be as transparent as possible with our planning process, and so that's what we're doing here. One of the most important things that will come out of looking at a 20-year planning horizon is what do we need to do over the next 4 years to start moving our resource portfolio to the directions that are indicated through the planning process. So that combination of two things, we're going to have a 4-year action plan and we're going to redo it every 3 years, is a pretty powerful dynamic in the IRP. And it's something that I put the most weight on when we're deciding what our recommendations will be. And then again, the goal of what we're doing here today is to improve our planning through a public advisory process. So, I like to say that all comments are welcome. They tend to sift into two categories. One is if you just ask me, this doesn't make sense. That does two things for me. It tells me that either I need to do a better job of communicating it, or sometimes it doesn't make sense because it doesn't make sense. So then I can step back and think about what we've done, and it does have a positive impact on our planning process. And then the other thing, and we're going to go through some of this data today, is P&M is constantly trying to understand the different resource options that are out there. We're constantly trying to understand the dynamics on our system, but we don't expect we know absolutely everything about everything. So we do have experts in the room. So when you see some of our assumptions, some of our data, we welcome people pointing out, hey, that number doesn't look right to me, and if you can document that or help us understand that, we will look at that in our process, and we'll either analyze it using one of our risk analysis techniques or respond to it in some way. Yeah, Peter, you have a question?
Yeah, Pat, after this meeting is done, are these slides going to be publicly available? Because I wanted to provide some of this information to my members and get our analysis going. So is that going to be a thing we can do?
Yes, that's one area of our process that we've got to improve going forward. I have submitted the slides from the previous meeting to our webmaster, so they should be on pnm.com as soon as today. But we're going to have to find a way to get that information out to people faster than the way we've been doing it. Part of it is just my group is working hard to make sure everything is well presented and correct, so we're kind of pushing up against our deadlines in terms of putting the material together. And then the other side of that is, for good reasons, pnm.com does not get updated very dynamically. So we need to find a new new way to make that work. But for the slides for today's meeting, we can email those. The slides for the meetings last week, those should be on the web page, I would expect today. But and we'll send a note out to the IRP group when we know stuff is there on the web page for you to access and use. Okay, going back to the goal of the IRP process, the outcome of this formal process is a report that we'll file with the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, and that filing will happen in June of next year. So we're early on in a process that's designed to take a full year. We're early on, but I think we've accomplished quite a bit, in fact, quite a bit more than we've accomplished in prior IRP processes. So I'm excited about where we're at and looking at where we're at, what the potential is to do a good job to finish this up. And then we have a listing of the legislation and the rules that govern the IRP process that we've provided for reference. So those are kind of the details and the rules and the regulation, but one of the things that we always try to keep in mind is, you know, as a planner, our goal is to strike some kind of a reasonable balance. Sometimes we get things where the least cost option provides all the reliability that we need, and it also reduces the environmental impact of our operation. So that's really what we're seeking in a process like that. Reality is sometimes you can get a situation where the thing that's the least cost over a long period of time might have an upfront cost, so you have to balance those type of issues. But anyway, that's just the higher level goal that we're after here in the IRP. So as we talk through results, we try to hit on all three of those aspects when we're describing what the analysis is telling us and what our recommendation is. Okay, so that gets me through just the kickoff introductory part. Just kind of stop here and see if there are any more questions that we have before we get into today's material. Okay, so for the follow-up info from last week, we've provided some data in slides. We've also provided data and handouts. Just broadly, the topics that we're hitting with this information right now is there were questions about our water intensity graph, so we went back and revised it to address the questions. We also had some good discussion and questions about capacity factors, so I'm going to walk through the slides on that here in this meeting today. We had a request for the data that's used to generate the graphs in the previous slides, so that's what the handouts are. They are just tables of numbers, and if you graph those numbers, you would be able to reproduce the graphs that we have provided. Primarily, it's the graphs that we've used to show the price curves. And then something that is funny, this is an excellent example of how the public advisory process improves our planning is, you know, we love our jobs, we do it all day, every day, we get in the middle of it. It doesn't occur to us we're using acronyms. So we've started building the acronym list for this year's IRP, and that's one of the handouts that's on your table. And for those of you on the webinar, I think that we've emailed those out to you just recently. So if you don't have them at the moment, check your inbox. If you don't find them there, go ahead and send Shane a note through the webinar, and we'll get them to you before the meeting's over. Okay, so let's look at this water intensity graph. The change over the first version of this graph that we presented is we added the treated wastewater that is used at some of our facilities. You know, before we were only showing freshwater use. That underrepresented the amount of water that's required, particularly at Palo Verde. But what this does is it illustrates, again, as an example of balance between the fresh water that's used and reclaimed wastewater. So not only at Palo Verde, a small amount of reclaimed water is used at Lordsburg, Afton, and Luna, I think. Or am I just seeing ghost on the graph here? So actually, looking at Shane, the difference is the treated wastewater that's used at Palo Verde. So that was kind of a good example of something that we understand working at P&M until we get into public advisory process. It doesn't occur to us all the time that folks aren't aware of that. So anyway, this is just an update of the graph that was included in our September 17th presentation. I got a question.
Oh, yeah. First of all, thanks for providing that water use intensity chart. And I think it is much more realistic to have treated wastewater because it seems like that's water from the waste stream. I have a question about this particular chart and what these numbers are. Are these numbers just the water used in the actual generation process? And are there other areas, mining and oil, natural gas, transportation, and all that other stuff that also includes the water usage?
Okay, the question for those of you on the phone was what is the reference point for the water use numbers shown on the graph. What we're representing here is the water that's used at each one of these individual generating stations. So to the extent that water is used outside of the station to produce the fuel or some other related activity, that's not shown on this graph. One interesting thing with San Juan is the water comes from the mining operation, so it's kind of a recycling use there too. Is the mine is underground, so dewatering the mine is something that's required to do just to accomplish the mine.
So I think that reflecting all water use involved in different types of generation, I think would be important. And I realize those numbers might be hard to get.
Yeah, the comment is all water use is important. We can look to see, but I do not expect to be able to get that information for the things that are beyond P&M's operation. That's a good example. Susan's pounding away on the keyboard, so we're collecting that comment. It's Dave.
I just want to be clear that the vertical axis is gallons per megawatt hour.
Yes. Yeah, we have the units are over here on the slide instead of on the axis, but yeah, gallons per megawatt hour. So it's a measure of intensity. Yes, Barbara.
Yeah, it would help me because I can't always keep it straight. I know Palo Verde is nuclear, but after that, I don't know which is the coal and which is the gas-fired plant. So that could be identified somewhere.
Okay, the question is to identify what technology is represented by each of these plants. I can walk through that with you right now, and future versions of this graph, we can do that. It's funny because that was on the previous slide. We had subtotaled it by technology, but there's quite a few where there was only one. So being engineers, we thought, oh, we don't need the subtotal because there's only one. But so we took it off. So I apologize for that, and we'll roll back to what we had.
You could even just color code them, on the axis or something, just the name so that we'll, with a key. I don't care which way you do it.
Okay, but in terms of this graph here, the first four plants, Reeves, Lordsburg, Afton, and Luna, are gas plants. Reeves, Afton, and Luna are steam cycle plants. Afton and Luna are combined cycle. Reeves is a steam turbine generator. Lordsburg is a combustion turbine for gas, burns gas. Four Corners, San Juan, coal. Palo Verde, nuclear. Then we have solar and wind, which we aren't attributing any water use for them. And then Valencia and Delta are natural gas-fired peaking plants. And again, we'll get that on the graph for future presentations of this information.
Question jumps out that the capacity factor, I went ahead, for Reeves it's only 5.3%, and yet it's a water
The question is the balance between the capacity factor for reeds, which is something we'll talk about soon, and the water intensity used at reeds. So if we get back up to the water intensity graph, what Tom has observed is that reeds, in terms of water intensity, uses a lot of water. What he's observed by looking at the capacity factor, reeds doesn't run very much. So that's what I was trying to allude to, is that when you look at these weighted average totals over here on the right, most of the water used is going to come from the high capacity factor plants. So that's going to be Four Corners, San Juan, and Palo Verde. So in terms of total water consumption, when we do run reeds, it uses water in terms of gallons per megawatt hour, but we don't run reeds that much. So the total water use at reeds will be small compared to some of the other plants. So I think the thing we can do there is include just total quantity, so you can see the balance, see how that works. Yeah, bud?
Yeah. On the Lordsburg plant, if that's combustion turbine, why is its water use intensity so high?
That's a good question. The question is that Lordsburg, why is the water use intensity so high? I would assume, especially compared to, say, Valencia and Delta. The answer to that lies in the technology that's used at the plant. You have choices in terms of cooling technology, and some use more water than others. So beyond that, as you know, my technology expert is on vacation this week, so we will come back and follow up with the technology that's used for cooling on all of these, in addition to the total amount of water used. And we are looking for suggestions of how to welcome Leaf back, as she has missed these 2 weeks. She'll be here Monday. Okay, so moving forward to the capacity factor, this was something that we realized wasn't on. We handed out sheets that documented existing system, and we also handed out sheets that showed the type of parameters we're including in the modeling for resources that we don't have on our system just yet, that we're including in the strategist model when we do portfolio construction. So just following up and trying to fill in that piece of data. First of all, just talk about capacity factor. What is capacity factor? It's a measure of how much we get from any one resource compared to its theoretical maximum. So how you calculate capacity factor is you know how many megawatt hours that you generated over a year from any one plant. And then there's 24 times 7 times 365, there's 8760 hours per year. So I multiply that 8760 hours per year times the capacity of the plant. So that gives me the theoretical number of megawatt hours that could be generated if that plant was operating all day, every day for the whole year. So then capacity factor is just a ratio of those two numbers. It's what did I generate versus how much in theory I could generate. So a high capacity number like Palo Verde, 91%, that tells you that that plant is just on all day, every day, especially relative to any of the other plants that we have on the sheet. The other end of the spectrum, and we talked about this a bit in the question about water, is our gas peaking resources. Those resources, their role in our portfolio is to provide capacity. So capacity is just the capability to deliver energy when it's needed. So when is it needed? It's needed on summer peak when the load runs up. It's also needed when there's quick changes in the supply-demand balance. An example of that would be, say, Super Bowl at halftime. I mean, this is a water example, but Super Bowl at halftime, the water demand on the system goes way up, You can end up with situations like that on the electric system also. So we have to keep the electricity supply and demand in balance all the time. So we have peaking capacity that helps us do that. It also helps us, as I say, the wind stops blowing, so our output from a wind farm starts to decrease. We can fill in what we're losing from the wind farm with a gas plant while we're out there trying to make a market purchase or ramp up one of our baseload resources to keep the thing in balance. So that's the role that the peaking resources play. So they're important because you need them there to make sure you're reliable, but you don't run them very much. And then renewable resources, those we're not flexible on when we take the electricity. Basically, when the sun's shining, when the wind's blowing, they generate. And so what those numbers are is just a reflection of how well the machines on our system are performing in terms of converting what's available into electricity. And most of that's a function of just hours of sunshine and hours that the wind's blowing and at what speed. Okay, so that was the capacity factors for our existing resources. These are the capacity factors for all the new alternatives that were on that sheet that we handed out on the 17th. So this sheet ties to that sheet. And these resources that are on this page don't exist yet. I mean, that's the concept, is they were presented to the model as choices when it's building different portfolios. So that's why we have on the peaking, intermediate, and base load, we have a range, because that just gives you an indication that when the model picks one of those resources, it generally will also dispatch the resource in a range covered by these numbers. So if you think back to what our existing peakers were, they're on the order of, say, 5%. So when in Strategist, if we say, hey, the portfolio is picking another resource, like example, this large gas turbine, which is part of the San Juan replacement, it will also show that it's running probably less than 20% of the time, maybe more likely, 10% or less. On the other hand, if we're going to incur the cost to build a combined cycle plant, it will tend to run in this range, 20 to 65%, and again, compare that to Luna Athens in terms of capacity factors. I'm starting to collect some questions here, so I'll slow down. Yeah, Dave?
I need to go back to look at the previous graph. Do we have any idea what the historical capacity factors are for these various technologies?
You're talking about is this the slide you were talking about, the 2009-2012 capacity factor graph?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, do we have any concept of historical capacity factors? Answer is, with one exception, the solar farm where we have 1 year of data. These are an average of those 3 years worth of production, so it is recent history.
But you don't have it by year.
We're not presenting it by year here, but we certainly have that data.
Right.
So we can supply a table with historic capacity factors. And Chuck, you had a question.
Do you assign capacity values to these different resources?
Yeah, the question is about capacity values. That's a concept that kind of shakes out in the model. Is what we assign for the resources is what it costs to build, what it costs to operate in terms of, keeping it in good repair and fuel to operate it. And we also assign for things like a gas peaking plant what its capability is. If I turn it on, how many megawatts will it generate? So that's the type of information you give to the strategist model. Then the strategist model looks at a supply-demand balance, and it says, well, gee, you don't have enough capacity. Your system might not be reliable because you don't have enough to cover, say, summer peak. So then what Strategist will do is within a reserve margin range, it'll build portfolios. So it'll build every portfolio where you could add a resource that will fit into that range. So that's how we end up with thousands of them. It'll look at, it'll build a, you could roll forward to the next slide. Say with our reserve margin tolerance, we could add, say, 100 megawatts more of capacity. So Strategist will build a portfolio that has, say, 2 40-megawatt plants. It'll build a portfolio that has this reciprocating engine option. It'll build a portfolio that has a small gas turbine, and then it'll move on. So it'll look at the next year, and it'll say, okay, is there any, and it'll build a portfolio that has nothing also, if we're above the reserve margin tolerance. So it'll create, in my example, 4 portfolios. And then it'll move on, and it'll do that every year. So you can think through the different combinations, permutations of that. That's how you end up with thousands of portfolios. After it's built out thousands, it looks at what the net present value of all thousands of those are and sorts it. So when it sorts it, you'll come up with the least cost. And depending on conditions, did I need, what was more valuable to me at that time? Was it capacity? Was it, I need more cheap energy? It'll balance those things in the calculation of cost, and by sorting it, it gives you a portfolio that's the most valuable mix of capacity and energy. So, long version of the answer to your question, which was yes.
Okay. Well done.
I apologize for that. I've been in training, or I'm supposed to start with yes. Sorry, Peter.
Do you have any information on the contribution of the intermittent resources at system peak? That type of capacity information?
The question is, do we have information on intermittent resources at peak? So I guess my follow-up with that, are you talking about historic or going forward?
Well, I would assume that you're going forward is going to match your historic. I mean, that's all you have to rely on. So I'm talking about historic.
Okay. And in terms of the answer to your specific question, in general, the intermittent resources will be on at summer peak.
But you have actual capacity factors that demonstrate, say, for instance, if you've got 100 megawatts of wind at system peak, do we have 27 megawatts being delivered, or is it 40, or is it 13%? Where is it? How does it coincide with peak is what I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, for each resource, okay, the question is, how do we account for capacity at system peak? And so that goes back to when I was describing each resource. When we put it in the model, we give it, the model, a description of the resource's capability. So for the peaking resources, intermediate resource, baseload resource, those are things that we drive. So we tell it that on system peak, you can get up to what we believe is the physical limit of that resource. For the renewable resources, since we're not in control of how much it will provide each hour, what we do is look at historic data for example, for our solar, and we know that for our summer peak that our fixed tilt solar facilities produce 55% of their capability for summer peak. So when we put that resource into the model, that's what we tell the model is the for peak. Try to use numbers that are easy for me. Say it's a 10 megawatt solar resource for peak, it will give me 5.5 megawatts. And so we build that for all of our renewable resources. For solar fixed tilt and for wind, we've got data that's based on existing facilities. For the solar PV tracking, which is what we're saying is part of the good cost-effective resource mix for San Juan capacity, what we have is bids that were received. We're going to be building that technology next year. But because in that case we had bids, not data, we spent a long time examining what if the bids aren't right. You know, we looked at the range of what the capacity on peak might be that I would still make that selection. And if just in isolation, if that's all we're looking at is capability on peak, then we still would make that selection even if the single axis tracking looked like fixed tilt. And so I know the single axis tracking is going to be at least as good, should be a lot better than fixed tilt in terms of contribution on summer peak. Yes, but
could you expand on that with regard to solar trough?
Yeah, solar trough is a solar thermal technology. So in that case, you're taking sunlight and converting it to heat, and then letting the heat convert it to steam. So the advantage of a thermal system like that is not as instantaneously reactive to is the sun shining or not. So you have a little bit of a buffering effect there. And then the other thing you have with trough is generally the trough systems look more like the single axis tracking systems. So you know, the designs I've seen, you tend to try to track the sun so you get the same kind of advantage that you get with a single axis tracking. So that's the kind of the technology details that we're thinking through and looking at when we make that assignment of what's its capacity on peak. And then I don't know if we have that on the
Not trough, but
yeah. Yeah, so I think what you've highlighted is another piece of data that we should add to this sheet that we handed out on the 17th, generation costs and performance data for new alternatives. So we can include the contribution on summer peak for these technologies also. For the existing technologies, we have notes on this load and resource table that we handed out on the 17th that shows you how we're looking at those for summer peak. The load and resource table is just a snapshot 1 hour look at the system. And the hour that is the highest hour for us is the summer peak. As we go forward and start doing things like looking at more wind and renewables, you know, I talked about the demand, was it last Friday? And so our winter peak is like 85% of our summer peak. So that's going to be something that will be more interesting to look at as we've got summer peak that's being well covered by solar. We'll also have to start looking at making sure that we're hitting the winter peak, which tends to happen after the sun goes down. Yes, sir, Rob?
Just that I've been familiar with a lot of wind energy testing throughout the state at optimal locations, including on PNM system, and I'm just wondering if the capacity factors are accounting for the optimal locations. I mean, we're getting numbers like 40 to 50% net capacity factor with current technology, like G 1.7s or what have you. If technology is improving, those locations, that we're assuming for capacity factor, well, I would imagine should be optimal locations, but there's enough of them here in New Mexico. So are we factoring the capacity factor properly? I mean, it seems to me much higher from my assessment.
Okay, the question is about the capacity factor that we're showing for a wind resource. And what Rob has pointed out is testing implies that if you can get a higher capacity factor in some situations than the 33% we're showing here. That's a good example of the kind of thing that we try to handle with sensitivities. we're kind of caught on that between what we know, because the two wind farms that we're looking at, the one that we are currently using, the New Mexico Wind Energy Center, and the one that we're proposing to buy, the Red Mesa, both of those have capacity factors that are a lot less than 33%. So then when we get presented bids for future wind centers and the bids have capacity factors that are higher, we don't have any way to verify that if it's not an existing facility. So the way we address that in the modeling is we try to take something like capacity factor and vary it over a potential range and see if it affects our opinion on that resource. And for wind, the thing that tends to drive the bus isn't capacity factor, it's a contribution of capacity on peak. So yeah, we look at that as a sensitivity in the modeling. The more important variable when we're looking at the wind farm is how much is it producing on our peak demand. Got a follow-up?
It's just that for the existing plant, the Red Mesa and the Tucumcari, are you using the existing technology for those? Or can you model the current updated technology for those?
Excuse me. Yeah, the question is, when we're looking at wind, are we using only existing technology or looking at future technology? And just to reiterate, when we are looking at a technology on our system and we're getting information, for example, through bids, that maybe the current technology is better than what we have, we address that by doing a sensitivity analysis on the variables that affect. So yes, if we vary the capacity factor in our model, then we are modeling whether the technology that could be built is better. And then just another point on Red Mesa is it is a fairly new wind farm. So Bruce.
Your solar trough with storage, I'm not current on that, but I imagine that's still pretty far out as far as being a very practical thing. So the use of newer alternatives is appropriate, of course. But you can do the same thing with nuclear with the small modular reactors. This is going 20 years out now. I might not live to see it, but I think that it is on the horizon. You might have it just as with an asterisk or something like that.
Okay, the comment is that in addition to the technologies that we have on our sheet, we should think about small modular nuclear reactors. And I know we did look at that in the last IRP, and so we'll get back to you on that. I think we've done a technology assessment on that, but I don't want to say anything about our assessment without the benefit of my expert ears. Yeah, it's Dave.
We've learned a lot about the energy collector systems at these wind farms. Some of it painfully learned, a fair amount of it since New Mexico Wind Energy Center was built. Are there any O&M factors on that side of the wind farm operation that are impacting capacity factors? Are there outages that are really costing you capacity?
Yeah, let me try to reiterate that question. I won't use exactly your words because I'll try to say it how I think I understand what you said. And it's based on our experience with the wind farm. Are there any costs on the system in terms of outage or operations and maintenance that are directly attributable to the wind farm? Is that fair? The answer to that is we've attempted to look for that. We had, as a result of, I don't remember which case it was, we wrote a report on that. And it's difficult to quantify just because of the amount of data that you have to sift through and whether the data is actually related to answering that question directly or not. So I don't have a number to give you for that. On the other hand, what we do know, and it's fairly easy to observe just from looking at data, is that the wind can go from 0 to full output in a really fast period of time. So those are the kind of things that are easier to understand and quantify, is that in order to keep the system reliable, we have to be able to predict that that's going to happen. We have to have resources on the system that can spin up very quickly to get to a good level of generation so we can balance those dynamic changes quickly. So those are the type of things that when we're looking at a portfolio that has lots of wind, we also have to make sure we have sufficient capacity of fast reacting generation so that we're in control of, so that we're able to balance those changes. There's been some great questions. Let's see, oh, yeah, Dave?
Yeah, I do have one question. Are you looking at, there are wind systems all over the world. Some of them with very long histories compared to what we're doing here. Have you been looking at availability or capacity factors as a function of time for those systems as well to give you some sort of forecast capability?
Yeah, the question is if we're looking at how capacity factor changes over time for known or existing wind facilities. I'm not aware that we have done that. Most of the investigation that we do is along the lines of what Rob was suggesting, is that the next wind farm, how capable will that be? And then the other side of it, we haven't observed any degradation at our wind farm. I mean, really, the variation from year to year has a lot more to do with was this year windy or not. So that is such a large variable in how much you got from the wind farm. That's more important than the degradation of the technology. And then that's another thing that, you know, we're buying the wind farms from NextEra. They've got a really interesting and do a good job. They've got a big computer center in Juneau, Florida, where they can look at individual engines on each of their wind turbines and look at how that engine performing and get in there and do maintenance cycle before the failure happens. So the industry is doing a good job of keeping track of that too. And in our case, they operate our wind farm, so they're handling that for us. Then Bruce. Oh. Okay. So the next slide, I just wanted to point out that we have handed out an acronym sheet, and we have handed out the data used to build the graphs. Those are paper handouts that are in the room. There were other follow-up questions about the modeling methodology that we use to help generate the price curves. I've been working with PACE to develop that. I've got a first draft of a response to a bunch of the comments there. But until I work with it a little bit more, it wasn't ready for the meeting this morning. So that's another item that falls in the bucket of we will get it to you soon. And soon should be sooner than it has been, and I understand that, but we will share that. So that was, of the comments we received, I think we hit the bulk of the big ones with some follow-up. Still acknowledge that we need to provide about how the PACE model works. So a question from Tom.
Yeah, you're about to hand it off to Dean.
Well, I was going to either hand it off to Dean or entertain a break. So.
Quick question then. I've been spending a lot of time puzzling over the loads and resources table that you handed out and trying to reconcile the data in it with the data in the handouts and not doing very well. So I was just wondering if you could explain what this load and resource table is from, and when we might expect something like this or something like results that we've seen in prior RFPs for a given scenario.
Okay, the question is just an orientation around what the load and resource table that we've handed out so far is. It is just a documentation as part of the existing system documentation. So the only resources that are on the table are either existing resources or resources that we have proposed for approval by the NMPRC. So included on it are items like the Red Mesa wind and the single axis tracking system that we're hoping to build next year. So that's what it is. It's kind of a snapshot of where we're at. So you're right, as we move through the IRP process, we start building out, I was talking about taking the portfolios beyond San Juan replacements. We will start showing load and resource tables for how it looks over the full 20 years when you, what the result of those portfolios would be on load and resource tables. So, for example, yeah. So does that answer your question, first of all?
Was this load and resources table part of a commission filing, or is it just illustrative for the IRP?
It's an illustration for the IRP.
Of the existing system at Sept?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Barbara?
Yes, these are all in PNM's resources, right?
Correct. Yeah, the question was, these are only PNM resources, and that's...
So, is there any possibility of factoring in a couple of other things? One is the non-PNM solar, any information you have on that you get through net metering or some other contribution to the system. And secondly, is there a need to put in here something about how much capacity PNM is buying when its own resources, including those that I just mentioned, do not meet your capacity needs?
Okay, the question, there's two questions. One is just reiteration that our inclusion of resources that aren't PNM, and so of course Barbara did an excellent job of highlighting the one exception to the response that these are all PNM resources. If you look at the load and resource table on line 2, it says forecasted incremental customer sited PV. Those are resources PNM doesn't own. What that reflects is the reduction in that 1 hour, peak hour demand on our system that's a result of customer-sited PV systems. And so that's a reflection of who is in the program now and what those resources are providing. And then the follow-up, second question was about showing the capacity that we buy, I suppose, during peak hour. And the answer to that is we don't necessarily plan to buy any capacity during the peak hour. It's part of our responsibility to keep a reliable system. We have to show to WEC and NERC and other regulatory bodies that we have sufficient resources to meet the demands that we anticipate on our system. So that's not to say we don't buy energy on peak hour, because we are connected to a market, and we've got some very talented, dedicated folks over there at the Aztec building that are constantly asking themselves the question, what's cheaper, buy it or run my own resources? So we do buy, but that's not, we don't plan to cover our peak by buying resources from others. Yes, Chuck.
Well, you're still up there. CCA is not ready yet because it's still going through a lot of the state of it. Can we get scenario runs with different assumptions at some point in the future? It could be different assumptions within that.
Well, one of the things that just for today, the agenda, when I'm done here, then I'll turn it over to Dean. He'll talk about Monte Carlo. And then that's exactly what we're going to talk about is the scenarios that we're planning to run and have a discussion around what else maybe we should look at that's not on the list that I'll walk through later this morning. Okay. So yes, Dave.
Yes, during Steve Dean's presentation last time we met, I asked if we could have some average historical cost per kilowatt hour for various types of generation, including capital, O&M, and fuel, and also for energy efficiency. Steve said first if we would get that information, and we would try to get that information, and then
Well, we don't have that information today, but I mean, that's the kind of thing we've tracked and we'll keep on the list. And if for some reason can't do that, we'll let you know.
Okay, and then, so for historical, we should hopefully be able to get good numbers. For future, of course, I realize that there would be a range of those rates depending on assumption.
Well, and then have you referred back to the information we handed out at the first meeting? I mean, we did provide cost information for the new resources, and then we also did provide cost to operate and maintain existing resources.
Thank you.
Yeah, Tom?
Just to follow up, I think it would be helpful to identify sources of information when next time you do kind of like this, you know, it's not producing every data or like we did with the first data, just kind of where it comes from.
Okay, their comment is request for sourcing on information. Barbara, do you have another? Okay, so I think at this point we've been going an hour. It might be good just to take a short break, and then when we get back from the break, Dean Brunson will get up and talk about Monte Carlo analysis. That's an important piece of our analysis toolbox. Dean does a great job explaining that. So we will, for those of you on the webinar, we will be back online by, we'll shoot for 5 till 9 based on our experience. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my watch on here. It is right now almost 9:30, so we'll be back at 9:40.
Good 5 minutes. The solar is new.
Yeah, the wind, we're at 5%.
The wind helps you. Oh, that's right, Harv. How are you? Farmington, right?
No,
The wind helps you.
Most of the wind we get is in the spring, and then it's also not only in the spring,
Wow, good to see you.
winter heat is 5, 6 o'clock at night. So yes, it's better than 5%, but it's not 80%.
Okay.
I guess what I was getting at with that question, I'm a member of a sort of as what it turns out from this last week. The cables especially collectibles all the way up to the power, which is on the fringe workable distribution. Some of the early farms how could the cables go?
Yeah.
They are getting what's called what we used to refer to as alcohol started tailing off heads up. Some of that stuff out there is pretty collected. Tend to be all that not really entirely. That's the cost.
Yeah.
So I've got an opinion that start to use it electric. Year 15 of maintenance impact is coming.
Well, we're a bit protected from that because our contract is we just pay for what you deliver. So if your tables are coming out, you're not generating.
That's okay so long as the contribution.
Yeah, we're not relying on it. And the risk is not very
The other comment I have on the side, I had to
We've got some questions that so the risk is on them. Oh, yeah.
Higher levels. So the minute they got a guy, this is going back to almost 25 years. The minute they got a guy trained, moving halfway across the state, and he's retiring with a promotion.
Oh.
So there was no follow-up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it is what it is.
Yeah. That's something that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Not a problem. Yeah.
What was your question about No, I asked you a question about the historical stuff and European stuff, because what's been reported in the press, we've seen availability factors and they have a long history.
Yeah, no, we'll look at that. Yeah. Like I was telling Dave, one of the things is just those, our purchases, the contracts are designed that we only pay for what they deliver.
Right.
So if resource starts to decline, then the owner has to make a decision. I'm going to go fix this sucker. I'm going to step like money.
Right. Right. So that's pretty good.
And then we've seen, 2012 really windy year.
Yeah.
So it's really a lot of total over the year. So much so that I don't know if I feel discerned.
There's also a new technology coming out of solar cells. If you're very familiar with this, but get photons that come in and they hit the NP layer, they pop electrons loose and that generates current. That's how you get energy out of it. But a given photon coming in, it's really thin NP layers that go through. It either hits or it doesn't. And so that's why the efficiencies of solar cells are so dang low. But what they are beginning to do is they're beginning to build these pyramidal 3D shapes.
More likely to get.
So they're talking about the efficiency is 55%.
Oh, from a panel?
And that's a non-tracking panel.
Right.
Because this matters. There's a surface area direction. Yes. Right. So,
For amplifying. Yeah, those are the kind of things that, what we focus on now is replacement. That's
right.
But
your original goal is like
20 years.
Yeah,
that's the kind of thing. Yeah, you get to talk about technology.
Exactly.
Let you take it away.
I can't understand that.
know that Joe Blow company has got requested NRC to move on to a mixed license. The next generation, just that kind of stuff. Because it's hard to get well, we built this thing in the world or something. We built this thing in the world as well. So I get that. So let's stay in touch. You're on. You're on. It's time to go.
Yeah.
Tell them to sit down and shut up.
Oh, they are over here.
Shut up and sit down.
Good job.
Yeah, we've never pulled off a 10-minute break.
I don't think it's
Yeah.
say 10 and 1.
Yeah, interesting. We didn't say 10.
Yeah. Otherwise it would be 20.
No, it's hard to always. You can't start with this. So long as you I want everyone to get it.
All right.
I need to do it for large industrial products. They have their own power.
And of course,
You can find out. You're ready to roll whenever you're in our CV.
Which one?
Maybe we should go ahead and get started now. Looks like we're still online in the webinar. Everything looks okay. Thank you. My name is Dean Brudden. I work in the Integrated Resource Planning Group, and I'm going to talk about modeling risk, primarily price volatility and variation. I'm going to try and move a little quickly, so that means I'll probably be reading from my notes, and I may not be real good at looking up and seeing if somebody's waving their hand or got their name card or name can stuck up. So please just holler out if you can't get my attention otherwise.
Could you speak up just a little bit? There's a lot of hammering.
Okay. Is that better? Yeah, I'll try to hold it a little closer. The ERC's rule specifically asks us to look at risk in regards to volatility of assumptions and input factors. So that's part of why we go through these exercises. But it's also important to understand what uncertainty and volatility or variation in various components of our cost functions, what impact those have on our overall decision-making for resource planning. When we look at variables that are important and that we want to subject those variables to more intensive examination, we're looking for things that both have a lot of variability, there's volatility or changes, and also that are factors that have a major impact on our cost functions. So the list there on this slide are four that fit both of those categories, and so we give them a little more look. P&M employs statistical analysis to assess risk of portfolios. We look at historic or expected variability, and it's represented by probability distributions, and we use those to create simulations of large numbers of sets of conditions, and with which we can then test our portfolios and see how they react under these varying sets of conditions. And this technique is known as Monte Carlo simulation. One thing to keep in mind is that variation of input factors is not necessarily risk or not necessarily volatility. We know that our load is low at nighttime and gets higher in the afternoons. So that's a variation in load, but it's predictable. We know it's coming, and we model that in our optimization modeling, and we take account of that. Similarly, natural gas prices vary by season. We know that the price is likely to be higher in the winter, lower in the spring and fall, and a little bit higher in the summer when electric demand for gas is high. So those are variations and variance that we expect. It's predictable. What we're looking at with the Monte Carlo is a little different. It's the up and down or stochastic variation in those inputs that catch us by surprise, or that isn't following a predictable pattern. And so that's what we're going to do here. Look at next slide. Monte Carlo analysis is a technique for simulating variations in conditions, stochastic risk, and so on. And it's Monte Carlo comes from the idea of a casino and probabilities and things that aren't predictable, but if you study it long enough and you develop historic patterns, you can simulate those kind of conditions. And it's become very useful in all kinds of analysis with the advent of modern computing power. You don't have to drive a formula that explains everything. You can just throw computing power at it and simulate conditions over and over and calculate that way. So it's a fairly modern application. What we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the portfolios that come out of our scenario planning. So we've already talked about three portfolios, the FIP, which is the Federal Implementation Plan, and two variations of the State Implementation Plan, with and without the extra nuclear capacity. So we subject the portfolios that come out of our modeling optimization to lots of repeated tests or Monte Carlo simulations of different conditions, and that's the exercise we're describing here. It's useful to see what happens if everything goes wrong. How bad can things get if we get a set of conditions where all the high cost factors hit us at once? And it lets us know, is one portfolio more adept at reacting to those kinds of extreme conditions and able to contain the high cost and so on. So that's one objective. And also to just see if what we think is a diverse portfolio and ready to handle these variations, does it really perform when we actually subject it to all this test? We use a software product called At Risk from Palisades, Inc. It's a Windows-based Excel spreadsheet add-on, and it performs best fit probability estimations, and then it does the Monte Carlo simulations also. What we're going to give it, we just had the 4 variables on the last slide, and we have 20 years in our planning horizon. So we are going to have 20 years of 4 variables, so 80 different variables that will be input to our strategist model. And then we're going to run it 900 times, 900 different simulations. So that's the testing that we will subject our portfolios to. Last IRP we ran 300 draws, and then Shane got a new computer, so now we're doing 900. Next slide. Oops, did I miss one? There's one that looks like this. I got it. Is it in your package?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Just the concept there is we've got four variables, the little ones below, and I've got a little picture of the distribution. And for one draw of the 900 that we test, it's going to give us 4 different sets of load, gas price, market, electric prices, and CO2 costs. And so the idea is going to be most of the time you're going to see the variables come in near their expected value or the mean value for our standard reference case. But sometimes load growth might be low, gas prices might be high, and so on. So there's a little X on each of those pictures. And well, we may find that if gas prices are high, that may not be too bad. But if everything gets high, it could be bad. For instance, if an example might be if the rope attached to your safety harness breaks, that's not so bad, unless the ropes on the platform also break. So that's what we're trying to look at is when there's a correlation of all these variables, what does that do to our risk? So now we'll take a look at the individual variables. This slide here is just a history of natural gas prices. And it's up there to kind of show how variable that can be. There's lots of data points in there. It's the daily average Permian gas price over 10 years. What we do is once we get this data set, we're going to look at the historical variability and try to predict a best fit probability distribution, and then we'll use that to predict it for the simulations. A lot of, put in a few little historical remarks there. Maybe the most interesting thing is looking at the last 5 years. You see the prices are lower, still a lot of volatility, but it's probably a function of 2 things. The recession has reduced demand for natural gas, and the advent of fracking and horizontal drilling has lowered costs. One point that sticks out here is in February of 2011, in the Southwest there was a big freeze, and you remember the problems with our gas system and a big spike in prices there, so that shows up. Okay. Any questions on the graph there? Yeah.
We did use San Juan basin prices for, the new peak of this to be built up there. We refine the input variables to location.
Yeah, Tom's question was, will we use San Juan Basin gas prices? The graph that I have up on the screen now is Permian Basin. Yes, we do. We keep San Juan gas supplies most of our northern plants. There is a pipeline connection between the Permian Basin and the San Juan Basin. Runs from essentially Carlsbad up to Gallup. And so the 2 basins can be tapped with the connections. And there's an extremely strong correlation in the cost of the 2 basins. So, but yes, the location of where we put a plant is very important to have the right gas costs. Okay. So the next picture is load growth, and this goes back to 1990, and the green line is our peak load demand. It is for P&M North system. About 8 years ago, P&M acquired the service territory of Texas New Mexico Power that was in southern New Mexico. And so that's not included in this because I didn't have all the data back to before we bought it. But this is the bulk of PNM's load, and the green line shows the change in peak load over the years. The red and blue lines are the percentage changes from year to year. So that when you see the green line go up or down, you might have a year. What we're trying to demonstrate there with those bars is that load growth from year to year can be pretty variable. So you go from 9% growth one year, you could have a decline the next year. So that's a key factor. Load growth is a big determinant of what kind of resources we need to add to the portfolio. We have responsibilities to maintain reserve margins and adequate reliability, and so we need capacity. And probably growth of load is the key driver over a long run on what we add or how much we add. Other things that matter would be renewable mandates. We have to add renewables to meet the requirements of the Renewable Energy Act. And then the big one that's coming, of course, is if we have retirements at San Juan, we'll need to replace that capacity. So, so that drives a lot of our decisions when we do our resource optimization modeling. But for the risk analysis, what we're really looking at is the variability from year to year in the load growth. And by far the biggest determinant of that is changes in weather from one year to the next. Other things that matter, of course, would be the economy and individual large customers. If their particular conditions change, that could have an impact on our overall load growth. The first step we do is we look at the historic variability of the input factors. Barbara, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the relationship with load growth with the total load. You know, is that a big percentage, or maybe you're coming with that?
No, this was where I should have made it clear. This is the total load growth, or total load, and it's on this axis. So you can see back in 1990, our load was a little over 1,000 megawatts at peak, and we're up to around 2,000 now.
So in 23 years.
23 years, we essentially doubled the load. So, was that the question that you wanted to see?
Yeah, I was just really trying to. Yeah.
Right, and then so on the.
Just look at these bars. They look big, but maybe they're not that big. This is the total capacity, and that's what or total load.
Yeah, that's a good perspective question. So the percentage change is over on the right index. So the difference between here and here would be 10% if we, in the extremes, which would be 200 megawatts at peak difference. That'd be one way to look at it. Dave?
How do you account for a doubling? Our population hasn't doubled.
Perhaps our customers realize that Dave's question is why do we think our load has doubled in 23 years when New Mexico's economy and population, at least in the PNM service territory, hasn't doubled. It would imply that the use per customer is increasing. What the drivers of that are, it's hard to say. I think more electronic devices and things like that would help on residential demand. Maybe the biggest in our service territory is changing from evaporative cooling systems to refrigerated air in homes. Might be a big driver. I'm getting a little out of my area of expertise, the load forecasting, but yeah, it's a pretty dramatic change, doubling, and 1,000 megawatts of extra peak demand is a challenge to meet. Anybody else? Cliff?
Did I hear you say that the PNM South isn't in this chart yet?
Right. It's in all of our other data, But to have a 23-year trend, I just took the parts of the system that were there 23 years ago. Okay. Sorry, I didn't repeat Cliff's question. He wanted to know, wanted to make sure that we hadn't excluded the southern New Mexico communities from our data. So here I've just put up some statistics from looking at the historic data, average and some growth rates and some of the highs and lows for natural gas prices and for load growth. We also did the same looking at wholesale electric prices, electricity prices, as one of our other three variables. The fourth variable that we're going to look at is the price of greenhouse gas emissions. And by that we measure that by carbon dioxide equivalents, and the price we quote is dollars per ton or per metric ton. That one we don't have historic data. There isn't a well-functioning market for CO2 emissions. It is driven only by conditions that we expect to have in the future. So we're going to have to come up with a different way, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, to estimate volatility of CO2 prices. So this graph is looking at the historical data, and it's the output of the software, trying to estimate the formula or the probability distribution that best matches the historic data. The blue blocks are the actual natural gas prices that we observed on that time graph a couple of slides back. And the red line is what the statistical analysis concludes is the best fit for that. The distribution we're using for natural gas prices is called a log normal distribution. I think most people are familiar with a normal distribution. It's the high in the middle, much less likelihood out at the tails. Log normal is very similar in its appearance with a couple of differences. One, it doesn't go below 0, and it tends to have a longer upside tail or high value tail. And we find that it's applicable very often in financial variables because you can't have a negative price of natural gas, so you don't observe 0 or negative values. And also, you tend to have more likely to have extreme cases or observances on the upside. Is that okay if I go ahead, Tom?
The two boxes with the lines up top for that graph.
Those are the, I believe they're the 5% tails. So 95% of the blue boxes come up to here, and then that's 5%. And likewise down here, 5% of the occurrences were below that line. It may be the 2.5% tail, I'm not sure.
What are the units on the horizontal axis?
The unit, this is an output of the software itself. This is occurrences, and it is so it just means how many. So if this line is twice as big as this one, that means there were twice as many days that natural gas prices fell between the two bands of this bin.
What's the unit on the horizontal?
The price of gas.
Dollars per million BTU?
Yes. Sorry, I keep forgetting to repeat the questions, but it asked questions on the axes of this graph. The x-axis is the price of natural gas in dollars per MMBTU, and the vertical axis is the number of, there were 3,000, I think, data points on that gas data set. So this would be, all 3,000 would be represented by those blue tabs. Okay. So that was our best fit for natural gas. The next slide then takes the probability distribution and that formula, and then it spits out the 900 predictions of natural gas price in the Monte Carlo simulation. And so the red dots are the output of the simulation. The axes are the same as before, price of gas on the bottom, on the x-axis, and frequency on the y-axis. So we're going to use these red values as our input to our optimization model. And the key assumption driving that is that the future is going to behave the way the past did. So gas prices are going to mainly hover around the middle, but there's going to be quite a bit of distribution around that mean. And then the next step will be we'll apply that distribution to our forecast from our PACE global forecast of gas prices. So we did the same thing with the load. Load was load growth from year to year. We assumed had a normal distribution. We had, of course, we only had 23 data points to observe, so it's harder to get the beautiful fit of when you have 3,000 data points. It smooths everything out. But load growth, we're applying a normal distribution from year to year. Then the third variable we wanted to look at was the price of wholesale market electricity. That becomes an input to calculation of utility cost in the model, because we can buy power from our neighbors, or we can sell power to our neighbors when we have excess or shortages in generation. And if you go back one, the red dots here are just a scatter plot of the daily Permian gas prices that we had a couple slides back with the price of electricity at the Palo Verde hub. And so if you just look at the red dots, statisticians would tell you that's a very strong correlation just by looking at it. You can see that when the price of gas goes up, the price of electricity tends to go up. There's exceptions where the price of electricity jumped very high, even though gas wasn't. And that's probably reflective of days when there was a stress on the electric system, not related to the supply of gas. So what we've done to quantify that relationship between gas and electric prices is we did a linear regression on that data set, and that's what the blue line represents. And so the blue line is if you have a price of natural gas then is the exogenous variable in this relationship. It predicts what the price of electricity will be. So that's why it's a straight line. And
is that on a daily basis, an hourly basis, monthly, or?
It's a daily price relationship. So it's the Palo Verde hub, which is over west of Phoenix, and that's where the Palo Verde nuclear plant is, and it's a very common trading point for wholesale electric transactions.
Yeah, Dean, sorry, but going back, at the end of the gas slide, you said you're going to do something with the gas, with this Monte Carlo simulation and the PACE gas price forecast, and I didn't quite understand the relationship between what you're presenting and the forecast from PACE.
Okay, Tom was asking where this is leading, the probability distributions of the input factors. How do we relate that to our projections of the various scenarios?
Could they put the slide back on?
Just go back to the gas up and down, or you want the history?
Well, I just want to understand what you said. Because you just
okay.
mentioned that you were doing something with the PACE data, and I didn't understand.
Oh, good question. Tom's asking for me to explain a little better where we're going with how the distribution functions for the inputs is going to relate to our scenarios. So PACE has given us scenarios. We call them clean, cheap, and reference, and those are projections of the median prices or the expected values for each of those four variables that we're looking at. PACE has given us a natural gas price, carbon price, and electric market price. And so what we're doing with these statistical tests is trying to see how much do gas prices vary, and then we want to apply that to if we're in the reference case and we have a lot of volatility around that price, what does that do to the cost of each portfolio. So that's the logic step.
So you'll apply this distribution to their expected value and variance.
Correct. Tom summarized it pretty well. We're going to apply our expected volatility for each of the variables to whichever scenario we're examining at the time and the portfolio that was projected from that scenario.
In other words, the pace curve will be the median on this distribution.
Yes, but it's asking if the scenario, the pace scenario, the reference case, is that the median value for, or the mean, excuse me, value for each of the volatility tests? And the answer is yes. I think that was Tom's question too. So. Okay, one more. So now the next thing is we know there's a strong correlation between gas prices and electric prices, and so we've estimated that relationship with that linear regression in the past. Now we want to try and project our variability for the price of electricity, and a couple of things are going to come into play. First is the relationship of electric prices to gas that we just studied. We also want to look at what impact is the price of carbon in all of our scenarios. What is that going to have on the price of electricity? And the theory we've come up with is that the price of carbon is going to drive the price of electricity based on the average carbon content of combined cycle gas plants. So that's what we've got here is a correlation or a coefficient that reflects the amount of carbon in a gas-operated plant per megawatt hour. So I'm zipping through this a little fast, but we're going to predict the price of electricity to be the relationship between gas and electricity plus an adder for our future projection of carbon costs, and then we're going to hit that with the variance, or the variability that came out of our study of the price of electricity. A lot of technical stuff in there. Peter?
Wouldn't the recent EPA rule on carbon pricing for new plants actually take the question? I mean, wouldn't it just normalize the cost of carbon across the board? Wouldn't you use that as basically the cost of carbon per ton, and then just compute that back into what each source is producing?
Yes, and then Peter's question was, will the new EPA rules, which I'm not totally up on, but so you might want to correct me, will that translate to a predictable and a stable price of carbon? Yes, and I think the answer there is probably yes. It will settle down the price of carbon. That's going to be subject to all kinds of demand and supply and so on, whether there's a cap and trade sort of market price and so on. So yes, that's what we've kind of started from, is we're assuming that it'll be combined cycle gas plants that will be at the margin driving the relationship between that price of carbon that Peter's described, translating that to an impact on the price of electricity. Okay, Tom?
Before we get further into how you estimate the electric price, Patrick said earlier that you're not optimizing the system for the wholesale market. The wholesale market is somehow outside of that. Could you explain, or Patrick explain one more time, what the importance of the electric price is for the modeling? It's a place where you dump power that from your existing portfolio, if the price is right, or you buy it for short, but it's not crystal clear yet.
Okay, you want me to take a stab? For our resource planning, when we run the optimization model, we try to decide what new plants to add or how many megawatts. We don't include the possibility of adding a plant because we think we can sell the electricity for a high price in California. So we've excluded it there. And there are certainly limitations on how much transfer capability in and out that we can access out-of-state markets and so on. But for the risk analysis, we wanted to take account that there is an opportunity to buy or sell when we're in an extreme peak load. We might want to buy some and not run one of our most expensive plants. And the model has that capability to put that in there. So for the risk analysis, we've added that. So maybe a little bit of an extra refinement. Okay, so so the point of this was we have a good projection based on historic data for the price of gas volatility and for load growth volatility, and we've used that information plus an assumption on carbon costs to drive the price of electricity. And so that as a result, we've come up with our four variables. And like I said, then we take the probability distributions and we create 80 data points, which is the 4 variables times 20 years. That becomes one draw in the Monte Carlo exercise. And so those 80 data points are then input to the strategist model, and it's run. And we calculate a cost of that portfolio. One more slide there. And then we do that 900 times over and over. Now, on those strategist runs, we've taken the portfolio from that scenario and we fixed it, and we hit it with these 900 different combinations of conditions. And the output is collected, and it tends to look like a fairly normal distribution. We get a lot of cases, a lot of the 900 end up costing about what our base case costs. But there are some that are much cheaper and some that are much more expensive. And so the piece of data that we then look at, as we have all 900 draws, is we look at the 5% break point. And then we take that value and we, for the next slide, we plot that on this graph here. So the 5% amount, how much the difference between the base and the 95% case is plotted here, and the total cost of each portfolio is plotted on the x-axis. So what I have on the screen there are the three scenarios we've discussed in our prior meetings. The ones in the circle are the 2 options for the state implementation plan, one being with Palo Verde nuclear generating station unit number 3 added to the portfolio and one without. And the case to the right is the federal implementation plan, which would install all 4 units would install selective catalytic reduction technology for the haze compliance. So what we see here is, first of all, that the overall cost expected from the federal plan is higher, it's farther to the right on this scale than the state plans. But we see, depending on which one we choose, for instance, if we compare the state plan without the nuclear option, it has a little bit higher risk. So that means in 5% of the cases, we're going to have an addition of 300 to the cost of the state plan. So we've only got 3 scenarios up there on the screen right now, so it's not real interesting because the choices are pretty clear. But once we get a 20 or 30 up there, then we'll start seeing that there's trade-offs between risk and expected cost. In this case, the difference in risk between the state and federal plan is maybe $50 million, but the expected value is about $200 million. Maybe a way to think of it is we could buy an insurance policy that avoids that $50 million of risk by moving to the federal plan. That would be an insurance policy, lower risk. But the insurance policy costs $200 million. So that's why I meant, in this case, it's a pretty easy choice between the state plan and the federal. Okay, Peter?
Is the risk associated with the revised state plan without Palo Verde and with Palo Verde, is that related to the volatility of the natural gas? Because without
Yes.
Palo Verde, we don't have
Right. Peter's question was what causes the reduction in risk when we move from the state plan without Palo Verde to the state plan with Palo Verde. There's a couple of sources that are most important. One would be the cost of carbon. Palo Verde doesn't emit greenhouse gas, so it wouldn't be subject to those cases or those draws where the price of carbon is very high. And also, when you include Palo Verde 3, you have less reliance on natural gas. That was Peter's question. Is price of gas and the volatility there also increases the risk. Barbara?
Yeah, yes. Is there any place in this modeling that you include the renewables? Do they factor in as a load, or how do you do your solar, your wind, and also non-TNM owned solar and wind?
Yeah, they're in each case, and they're other than the customer owned. Excuse me, Barbara's question was how did the renewables enter into the risk analysis? And the question is we model the utility-owned renewables, so our solar, our wind resources and such, as resources that can be used. In general, those are always dispatched. If the sun's shining, we take all the solar energy they produce. If the wind's blowing, we take all of that. And that determines how much we have to turn on the other plants to meet the load for each hour in the modeling. The customer owned, we do reflect that as a reduction of load in our modeling. And as you can imagine, the renewables are not subject to cost penalties if the price of gas goes up or if the price of carbon goes up. They do represent a large commitment of cost when they're built, and so that's a more fixed cost.
Is that then an amortized cost over time, or how does that cost factor in? I mean, yes, it's a front-end cost, but if you were to build a gas plant, that's also a front-end cost.
Right. So Barbara's question was how do we reflect upfront costs or capital costs versus variable? And on this graph, it would tend to be if you have your upfront costs, whether it's to build a renewable resource or a gas resource, would push you up here on this cost axis. The risk characteristics or the variable costs move you up and down here.
But then does that get amortized over time? So, okay, you have the cost up front, but then you won't have it 7 years out, so, but it's still produced.
Right. For Barbara's cost is Barbara's question is, do we reflect upfront costs as a cost that's spread out over the life of the asset? That is how we do rates. In this case, we judge this on the present value of the cost. So a dollar spent today is a higher value than a dollar spent 10 years from now in judging what's the impact on ratepayers. And that's the process of rate making and amortization of capital costs is the mirror image of that. It's taking a front cost and spreading it out. We're taking all of the future costs and bringing them back to a value today. So yes, we reflect the fact that the capital cost has a contribution over its life. Peter?
How are you reflecting the 50 megawatt for load management contracts that you have? Is that a reduction of load, or is that considered a source equal to a 50 megawatt gas-fired plant?
I think in our model we considered that a resource, right? And so we dispatch it when the conditions are needed, either high load, very hot. I apologize once again to the webinar folks. I'm not repeating the questions in advance, but Peter asked, how do we model the demand response programs which allow us to reduce load at the customer level? And we model that as a resource when needed. Bud?
How does your model decide whether a renewable resource is available or not?
We have a model, an hourly model, that shows load by hour, expected load. We also have production functions for the solar and for the wind that have a time pattern that's similarly spread over the hours. And so that's how we match. So each hour, the model looks at it, says, here's how much load you have, and some of these resources are available and some aren't on a probabilistic basis, and we input patterns that reflect the historic. So, Tom?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have my question formulated as well as I'd like. If the contract between San Juan Coal isn't executed before the end of the RFP or even before these runs for these two scenarios, how are you treating the price of coal? And should there be a probability of distribution around that and treated the same way as two?
Tom's question deals with the supply and cost of coal to the San Juan plant. The current coal contract expires in a number of years, and he's asking how we've modeled that. For the risk analysis of the volatility, we find that the price of coal is extremely non-volatile. It's under contract for the life of the mine. It's cost-based, and so depending on how much we pull out, it shows a little variability there. But compared to these other variables, our cost of coal per ton, it just doesn't vary much. But your question is, what happens when we renegotiate the contract when it expires, or if we renegotiate it in advance? That's a little different approach to risk analysis. That would be a scenario change. So it wouldn't really be appropriate for volatility because the price isn't up and down, and we're not. That's what we're trying to get at here with our risk tails and so on. So that we look at that with scenario differences. Okay, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. We have very few slides left, but I think this will be a fairly, hopefully, long discussion, and it's a much different topic than what we just heard. So what I was going to do is recommend we take one more short break, then we'll come back, talk about where we're at, where we're going, and what our plan is to get there, and then that will wrap it up for this morning. So if I can read my watch again, it is 10:30. So let's start up again, let's say at 10:45. Thank you.
Here we are.
Is there a reason why you're not continuing the discussion about modular nuclear energy?
That's something that we're going to talk about at the meeting. I mean, basically what we're talking about now are things that could use what we could do that. Really, where a lot of us higher work. I haven't started.
This is right.
When they do it that way. I'm not saying that you don't need to that this particular type of example.
Something else, yeah. You just don't
how long,
so I wasted all that money. But I have.
you don't know. You know, so why does small people, so we know that this particular site has to be more when I look at the graph,
Just get a heart attack once every year. Well, that's the old stuff, you know, with your kids.
I didn't put any.
Oh,
We like to eat the same.
You guys get to it again.
Oh, yeah, they don't.
They've got to do this. No, I mean, it's bigger.
No, you're really curious. Where are you from?
So you got on your own?
And then my students,
A lot of times we don't just say we want
And there are dates like
to pull it.
no, I said here,
anyway, somewhere along the line, people told us that's what you do. He was just that man. You know what? They can't be both of them. They do consider get your recruiter now. That's very but they have to carry the burden. Like it is my product. They can't say,
we'll try to do that.
Because we can't use that our brother to ask us to do this. We have to ask you, we can't use people ask us to do this, so we did it. So as long as the burden is on
You don't have to
and the same we're not looking at one of the questions that choice. That's right, when you were comfortable.
Just so you know.
That's
We moved over there and here to yeah. Well, after I moved here,
I know. Well,
Texas,
I had a laptop.
we really thought that.
And this laptop
It is, Chris, it was like you're in Boston.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I just couldn't say well, I did it a minute. I told him I never wanted to lose.
Already know I know. My webmaster is here.
Sales. She wanted to soften me up, so I went forward. Yeah, two very bad places.
No, but you know,
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started pretty soon here.
Yep. Do not interchange.
Okay, the last topic for this morning is just try to talk through where we think we're at in this process and the list of things we know we need to do. And, you know, throughout the meeting today, I think we've had some excellent comments and discussions around exactly what we're about to talk about. It is what is there that we still need to look at to have done a good job with the 2014 integrated resource plan. So the slide I put up here is, again, it's only one slide, but I think we might spend quite a bit of time talking about it. What we're showing are the scenarios that we know we still need to do and present in this process. I highlighted a few with blue ink on the table above because that is the scenarios that we have presented so far. You know, if you remember the graph that Dean showed that showed the concept of the risk tail versus the expected value, those cases were these ones that are in blue. So what have we done so far? We looked at two scenarios with a variation. We have the state implementation plan, including Palo Verde 3 as a resource, and over on the right, the state implementation plan without Palo Verde 3 as a resource. So that's one scenario. The other one is the Sept. So that's the second scenario we've run. And then I've added to the table the different scenario designs that I believe we still need to do for each one of those cases. So basically, when you're looking at load, it says high, mid, low, and looking at gas and carbon prices, high, mid, low. Those are the different combinations of load and price scenario that we want to run. And then after we run the scenario to look at how it affects portfolios, we'll also run the risk sensitivities on that. So coming into IRP, we've run lots of variations on this, so that's one of the reasons that we're confident with what we're seeing in this scenario where we've got the mid-load and the mid-pricing, and mid is the case reference case. We're confident that that mix, the nuclear, the gas, and the solar, is a robust solution in terms of what we need to do in the near term, anticipating retirement of San Juan Generating Station. But what happens after the San Juan Generating Station capacity is replaced with that robust mix of resources is the kind of thing that we really need to examine in more detail. So the design is to run it on a higher load and a lower load with our more current load forecasts. And then for the Sept, since we don't expect that this is really an alternative going forward, we expect because of the strength of the state plan that got approved in September that it's worth it to spend a lot of time working different high and low load situations in a world that we frankly don't expect to happen, which would be keeping all 4 units at San Juan. That's why I only have mid-load for that one. But we'll go ahead and look at the different price situations there so we can get a more full picture of what we've already identified as the risk of that portfolio. And then likewise, this portfolio where we're not using Palo Verde 3, I'm proposing, because we know we have a better option, Palo Verde 3, we don't need to go much further with that one. So that's my proposal of the designs that we need to do for the scenarios that we've run so far, how to build from that base. So anyway, I'll stop here. Got a question from Bob.
Going to the end of the chart there, without Palo Verde 3, how did you get to that point? What scenarios were run as replacement or options to Palo Verde 3 where it's in essence being discarded as a viable option?
Okay, the question is, what work have we done to get to the case where I think we can stop looking at portfolios that are without Palo Verde 3? And the answer is that we looked at the full suite of all of the resource options that are available to us between now and 2018 in that case, similar to the case with Palo Verde 3. So we did the same level of work in building out that portfolio as we did to build the portfolio that includes Palo Verde 3. And then when we observed with the Palo Verde 3 portfolio, first of all, it's just a lower cost option overall, and it reduces the risk by a significant amount. That's why, for me, I feel pretty confident that I know just building around that as a replacement option for San Juan is a good, robust base. So anything I want to look at going forward, I should include it. I mean, definitely we can spend the time and do all the combinations of those 3 scenarios with all 3 of those as a base. My suggestion is that because of what Palo Verde 3 has shown to be as a value to our portfolio, my premise is there isn't something better that we haven't already looked at. Yes.
Did you solicit bids on purchase power options as a replacement to Palo Verde 3, long-term purchase power options? And if so, how is that bid configured, or how did you go out on the market to determine that there is not purchase power that would be more cost-effective than inclusion of Palo Verde 3 at what appeared to be an undetermined cost, because you created a price threshold for bringing in Palo Verde at a capital cost, but not necessarily a lower level that Palo Verde may or may not be brought into the PNM portfolio.
And the question is if we'd run a RFP to look at using purchase power instead of Palo Verde 3 as a replacement option. The answer is that we haven't run an RFP to look at bids for purchase power options. But what we have done is include a full suite of natural gas options in the portfolio for that. And so, and going forward, we will have to do an RFP to look at the gas option in that replacement portfolio package.
Is it, I noticed that you're going to go out for an RFP for renewable resources. Is it a consideration to also go out for purchase power at the same time?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what purchase power means. Basically, we're talking about a market purchase, which means it's going to be priced at a value that, you know, the person that's selling it is probably going to tie it to what they think electric prices are going to be. What we're comparing that to is a rate-based resource, Palo Verde 3. And for our resource mix, Palo Verde 3 is, first of all, it's base load generation, so we get it around the clock, 24/7. We also get it as a rate-based option. It will be depreciating over time, so the rate impact will stay flat or decline over time. So it's hard to imagine how a market-based product would beat a rate-based addition for a base load situation.
So maybe hard to imagine, but it's a consideration to go out and ask and find that out, because I purchase power for my clients, and I'm finding a different situation on that right now.
Okay, so the comment is looking at a purchase power option rather than Palo Verde 3. So we've heard the comment, and so we'll just leave it at that. Yes?
Hi, I wanted to, my name is Athena, and I just want to speak a little bit of nuclear power. My first job coming out of college was about nuclear power. I taught nuclear power to sailors. Sailors heading out to sea to run the nuclear power plant on submarines and on aircraft. And one thing I taught them was, in the case of an out-of-control reactor, that the first thing you have to get to that reactor is you have to get water. That's the only thing that's going to stop that reaction. And so what do? You flood the reactor compartment with seawater. Seawater stops the reaction. Well, in the worst case, it won't stop it. You'll still get a lot of heat being generated. And the heat being generated will melt the reactor compartment, which will then melt the hull of the ship. And then the core will drop into the ocean. And the ocean will stop the reaction. That's what I saw. Palo Verde does not give me a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling. Palo Verde is next to a blue line on a map, the Gila River. However, that Gila River doesn't have any water in it. And so I ask you, should something happen? And we know that things can happen. Fukushima, Chernobyl, it can happen, either man-made or nature-made. Why are we looking at old technology, 30-year-old technology, and not considering, first and foremost, making our energy here in New Mexico with the sunshine that we have, and employing the people that we have with gas-powered plants? Not fully for them, but I know that might be a stopgap. But I really believe that we don't need Texas-based PNM telling us how we should be making our energy and getting our electricity here in the United States.
Okay, so just to summarize, we just heard a comment that, if I could summarize what I heard, is that one of the members of the Public Advisory Group feels that there are long-term safety or reliability concerns associated with nuclear power. Then the other thing I think I need to respond to in that comment is we are in PNM's headquarters building. That PNM is based in Albuquerque, and that the CEO works in this building. So it's not a Texas-based company. Yes, Peter.
Well, Pat, you probably ought to cover this. At what price per kilowatt are you using to model?
For the IRP, the concept was just, is that a good resource option or not? So what we did is we put it in the model and ran the price sensitivity up until it got to the point where it flipped to the portfolio with it's based on without Palo Verde 3. And I don't have that number at my fingertips.
Well, I heard in some situations you were more than 2,400.
For this sensitivity on the price and the load, it was over $3,000 a kilowatt.
And so therefore, anything less than that is going to be more attractive than gas.
Right, yeah. Less than that price, what that does is it, we present it as a tie in terms of net present value over 20 years. Anything less than that for price of Palo Verde breaks that tie and reduces the cost of that portfolio over the 20-year period. Yes, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that in the entire history of the United States military use of nuclear power, Navy, there have been no major accidents with nuclear power. I think that's a critical issue. When we talk about failures like Fukushima, they built reactors, all of them together, so if one failed, it affected the others. The second thing they did is they built the ground coastline, where the power for the pumps was in the basement, and so they couldn't move critical water through the reactor. So, candidly, there have been some really, really stupid mistakes made in commercial use of nuclear reactors. But in terms of new technology, they're looking at fuel cycles, that is, changing the way in which these nuclear reactors operate. That means that the end result, that is the net byproducts that you have to dispose of sooner or later, which have lifetimes of isotopes of thousands of years, those tailings are going slowly towards zero. They're not zero, but they're very small. So the entire waste product from my use of energy in my lifetime is less than the size of a Coke can today, and is probably a third of that in the next 30 years. So I see small nuclear reactors that are distributed plants so that you don't have the transportation of energy costs. I see that as a real option, not too distant future. So, I agree that we have enormous resources in solar, and I think that's good. But if you have a gigawatt of electrical power, that's great during the daytime. But what the hell are you going to do in the evenings? Because there are no ways of storing mass quantities of energy. And so renewables have a killing field there. And until we resolve that factor, I said we have a real problem with the application of green energy. So just trying to put some facts in perspective.
Okay, to summarize for the folks on the web, we just got another comment that talking about the safety and reliability of nuclear power over its history, and some additional comments about base load versus intermittent power. I think one thing that just, again, point of IRP, we're trying to facilitate a discussion around our plan. And so selfishly, what I'd like to do is if we could keep focusing on the scenarios that we need to look at through the IRP. So if while we're talking about the comments, about what we've heard from me and from other members of Public Advisory Group, if we could take those comments and try to help apply them to the task at hand, which is designing the IRP analysis, I'd appreciate that going forward. Got a question in the back.
know that it's pretty expensive construction, but with regulating carbon on the horizon, sort of not having a fuel cost with geothermal and sort of having it be able to run all day and not having like intermittency problems. Seems like the expected capacity for that plant went down a huge change last time around. Has there been any thought of how to actually ramp up the capacity of that plant and make it more adjacent, or is it just to say, you know, it's kind of like solar and necessarily experience not really need to be cheap enough? How does that kind of fit into the big picture?
Okay, for those of you on the phone, it was a series of questions about the treatment of geothermal and the modeling. I'll try to pick up each of the questions and then hopefully we'll get them answered. One is just the price of geothermal, and how we're modeling geothermal is a power purchase agreement, and so the price that we've included in the modeling reflects the pricing that we have received for our geothermal PPA. So you're right, if we built the geothermal plant and included it as rate-based, then it would depreciate like other assets do. But geothermal, the technology that P&M feels that it's better to leave to experts who are familiar with that resource. So that's why we chose to go the PPA route with that technology, and going forward, that's how we're modeling that future geothermal would be included. Another item I heard in the questions was a misconception, I think, that somehow the capacity for our geothermal PPA changed recently. What the geothermal PPA that we got approved last summer was for a 10 megawatt geothermal facility. The PPA has an option to increase, but we've never exercised that option, and so there has been no change in the capacity expected from the geothermal facility. So were there any other questions on the point of what you were asking? Okay, the question is, can we see geothermal as being useful for baseload down the road? And the answer to that is we see it as potentially useful as baseload down the road. And so that's why we've included it as one of the resource options that's available when we're optimizing portfolios. So then, as we go through this process, it'll be interesting to see if it ever shows up in one of our most cost-effective resource portfolios. It's Dave.
This always comes up, and I think I've made the same comment previous IRP cycles. There's a tendency that all of us have to read something in, I'll use an example, popular science, and believe that that's a rational alternative for a thing like a 20-year plan. And as an example of how I think you shouldn't do that, I'll pick on small modular reactors, because there haven't been any of them, to my knowledge, fully approved, much less built yet, so I don't know that that's a realistic thing to even spend time on beyond this little bit in the 20-year time frame. And there are all sorts of similar things kicking around about storage technologies for renewables. And just before that gets started, I contend that that's not a factor in the 20-year horizon.
Okay, to summarize for those on the phone, again, that was a comment from talking about just, I think if I was going to summarize that, I'd say is you should look at more than one data point when you're forming your opinion on the future of technologies that don't exist yet. Is that a fair summary, Dave? And frankly, that's something that I want to get to while we're on this slide, is that's an important, this whole concept of what type of technologies will appear in the future, potentially within our 20-year time frame. We need to build we call it a technology breakthrough scenario. There may be more than one, where we need to look at things like small modular nuclear reactors. We need to look at large bulk storage that will help us integrate the renewables to the load. So that's one of the scenarios that I've got on here as a bullet item, and we will definitely talk about that over the next hour. Is Peter?
Yeah, Pat, just real briefly, returning back to the geothermal question, what is the maximum achievable capacity that you guys are modeling in your 20-year plan for geothermal?
Yeah, the question is what's the capacity for the geothermal that's in the modeling. The load and resource table, again, is a 1-hour snapshot. So for the 10 megawatt PPA for the geothermal facility, we were showing 6, and so what that is that for that technology, geothermal, when it gets hot, the capacity is derated a little bit. So that's just the contribution on peak is 6, but the capacity nominal for that resource is 10. And until we get the thing built and online, we won't know for sure what we've got. So that's a number that we've got in there as an assumption right now. It'll change as time goes on.
Do you have any projections that geothermal field may be able to produce 30 megawatts? Or have you ever, I'm just wondering about, moving out 20 years in the future, how you would maximize the benefit of that capacity that can be used as base of renewable energy. It's clearly a desirable thing if we can get it for this cost. That's reasonable. So I'm just wondering how modeling works on that resource.
Yeah, the question is about what's the potential for geothermal as a resource. The example we've been using is the one project that we have signed a contract with, the Lightning Dock facility. Potential for that resource, we're hoping to get the 10 that we've contracted for because the option in the PPA, we believe that the technology experts think that resource can get to 15 megawatts. So that's that one site and that one project. If you look at a map of geothermal resource potential, New Mexico has more than one good spot potentially for geothermal. So that's the type of resource where we're modeling it with let's take the next step type of thing. If the model picks geothermal at the size we've given it, then we'll give it another one and just keep building that resource as long as the model picks it as an economic choice. And I don't believe that we feel like we're limited on how big that resource could get. If it starts picking it and we start looking at 50 megawatts of geothermal, then we'll need to take a step back and convene folks who know more about geothermal than I do and see if we can get a better definition on that potential size of that resource. But for right now, it's a cost-benefit question. Yes, Barbara.
I guess that gives me a couple questions. The load has changed. I mean, your graph has shown that pretty dramatically. What kind of statistics can you bring in to project future load changes, future demand? Certainly, as someone suggested, the popular literature suggests that, and probably experience as well, that there's going to be a lot more increase in demand just because we're finding more ways to use electricity all the time, and you will be impacted. So that's one of my questions. How can you incorporate that in the model? Then secondly, how do you incorporate the benefits of a distributed generation in terms of, say, more localized loss of power than when a big part of the grid goes down versus a smaller part of the grid goes down? What kind of opportunities are in some of these different scenarios, and how we might bring that into the discussion? And then I guess the third question to me coming up out of this just recent commentary on geothermal is citing location of new of new facilities vis-a-vis reducing the amount of distance for transmission?
Okay, so we have a few comments, and they are right on line with what we're talking about here, is scenario and sensitivity design. First one was about the concept that we've all seen the growth in the amount of electronic devices and other gizmos that we have in our home that has helped drive demand higher. How do we address that in the IRP? The fundamental way we address that is by building these scenarios around the high and the low load. Rather than try to predict when that could happen, overnight, I guess one of my favorite examples, and forgive me, Dave, because I think it's a popular science article, but is there was a news article recently about an inventor or innovator who was saying, hey, if we want to transport people in California, we can build tubes and put them in tubes and blow them from Sacramento to LA or something like that. So that was an interesting idea, but I looked at that and I said, that's a lot of electricity that's required to make that work. So rather than try to pick an event that would cause us to jump from mid-load to high load, we'll just run those scenarios and see how the portfolios are different. So that's a risk that maybe we're not addressing in IRP, is that it takes a while to develop new generation resources. If something discrete and big happens, then we might be scrambling, but then that's just reality. But for planning, what we do is try to look at portfolios, and the premium on my 4-year action plan is to have resources that, first of all, meet a reasonable set of conditions between now and in the near future, but also we'll have some signposts and some things to watch for that might cause us to want to jump from what my recommendation would have been or is for the middle ground to a higher load or lower load scenario. So that's how we think about that. That's how we address it. Next question was about the opportunity if part of the grid goes offline. Again, that goes back to discussion that we've had a little bit throughout the day. We model the system, I think of it in terms of resource planning, that it's our job to carry our own water. So we're looking at our balancing area and keeping our balancing area whole in terms of having resources to meet the demand. If part of the grid next to us went offline, then two things are going on. You have a loss of demand, but you also probably have a loss of some generation. That's one of the reasons why we try to keep our system whole so that we can stay afloat. And then we do have partnership agreements with our neighbors, so we can come to their aid, they could come to our aid if something like that happened. So that's on the bad side. On the good side, if there is a need for power outside of our neighborhood that we can sell into that system, then mechanically what happens is P&M will sell it, and then that becomes a credit that flows back to customers through the fuel clause. So that's how that works. How does it affect the planning? We, again, try to plan for what's going on in our balancing area, and then we can do things like what Dean just described and go ahead and turn market interaction on in the model to see if that improves or, well, generally it will improve the risk profile of a situation. And then, forgive me, I remembered two, but not the third point.
Transmission versus siting.
Transmission versus siting. Transmission investment scenario is something that we still need to do here. If you've been involved in IRP before, you'll know we've talked a lot about Path 48, Path 42. It's transfer capability of power into and out of the Albuquerque area where most of our demand is. We've been citing things within the load area. So what we'll look at in IRP is what kind of investments are required, available, et cetera, that instead of citing things in Albuquerque, maybe we could cite them, I don't know, in the southern part of the state and get a lower elevation, or on the eastern side of the state, and maybe get better generation characteristics for a gas plant, for example, out there, or increase the potential to bring wind in from that side of the state. So that's something that we need to do in this IRP is look at opportunities with transmission. Generally, transmission projects take even longer to build than generation projects, so that's another reason why we felt good about doing this piece first. I think there might be potential out there on the transmission side, but will it help me with the retirement of San Juan? That looks unlikely.
Because I was actually thinking of the flip of that. So how close you can site to where you need. And it seemed to me that we had that discussion in the previous IRP.
Yeah, and then that's another thing that happens when you shut down 2 units at San Juan. You've opened up an opportunity to site a generation resource at an existing generating site without having to incur much, if any, transmission cost. So that's another thing that how we've thought about transmission so far. I mean, when we're talking about gas peaker at San Juan, it's because the transmission's already there. We're in a gas production basin. So it just feels like that's a good site. Rob?
Just a question or concern is with the scenarios that are with the revised state improvement plan with Palo Verde 3 versus revised state improvement plan without Palo Verde 3. It comes across as a little absolute. Like, why not also consider revised state improvement plan with some Palo Verde 3 versus all Palo Verde 3. Now, I know what I'm saying is different degrees of Palo Verde 3. Is that considered, or does it have to be a certain number of megawatts from there?
Okay, the question is if we've looked at sensitivity around how many megawatts of Palo Verde 3 we would include in the portfolio, and what we've seen in terms of benefit to overall cost, risk, that type of thing, that frankly, if Palo Verde 3 was bigger than 134, that would be what we'd be looking at. So we've, with San Juan, we're looking at replacing 340 megawatts of baseload capacity. We happen to have an opportunity with 134 megawatts of baseload capacity at Palo Verde 3. So that doesn't get us the full replacement. The reason that the SIP is, one of the reasons the SIP's better than the FIP is we don't have to replace baseload 1-for-1. So yeah, you're right, there might be an optimal mix there. But what I'm saying is with the benefit we've seen to the portfolio at 134, it's more likely that we would want more than 134 than less. Yes, but
To follow on from that, I don't understand how, well, to go back to the previous IRP, when you dropped out 200 megawatts from Four Corners or 200 megawatts from San Juan, you were going to replace that with 200 megawatts of combined cycle. And it turned out that neither one of those were economically feasible. So one of my questions is, why weren't they economically feasible, since that's the direction you're taking now? My other one is, how do you make up the gap on the baseload power? You're saying that you're going to build a peaking plant rather than a baseload plant.
okay, so the question is trying to reconcile the current recommendation to what the findings were in the IRP 3 years ago. One of the things to keep in mind of IRP 3 years ago, this revised state plan wasn't something that was contemplated. Basically, what we're looking at is a combination of shutting down units and installing SNCR, a much less capital-intensive technology. What was looked at in the previous IRP was shutting down units or installing SCR. So that one of the things that bridges that gap, where the shutting down the capacity at the coal plant and replacing with something else looks economic now, whereas it didn't 3 years ago, is because we're saving capital dollars on the NOx reducing pollution control. And then, to go to the point of why aren't we replacing baseload with baseload 1-for-1, even when the previous IRP, when we were looking at it and had a combined cycle replacement, that we're replacing baseload with intermediate. That's kind of a semantics game, I guess, because intermediate is talking about capacity factor, but we weren't replacing coal with more coal or more nuclear in that case. So the concept that we don't have to replace the San Juan coal capacity 1-for-1 with baseload, I don't think is a new concept. It's something that maybe we could have communicated better in the last IRP. And then to get to why we think the mix now works is, San Juan's an around-the-clock 24/7 resource. We're able to replace some of that with an around-the-clock 24/7 resource in Palo Verde 3. Then we're also replacing some of that with a solar resource, which has a characteristic that does a good job. It's not perfect, but does a good job of matching the increase of demand over the baseload. The solar is there through the summer hours when the load goes up. So the combination of the solar and the San Juan or the Palo Verde gives us a good replacement for the energy we need. And then that combination isn't perfect. There are still some gaps that have to be filled. Like winter capacity need, for example. Just maintaining reserve margin after we retire 340 megawatts of capacity. So those gaps are getting filled from something we talked about, which is a gas peaking plant, and some of the energy gaps get filled from existing capacity at Luna and Afton. So if we have a need for energy that's not covered by Palo Verde and solar, we can run that, supply that cost effectively from existing gas plants. Need for capacity just to maintain reserve margin system reliability, that the cost effective addition is the gas plant. Cliff.
When you're looking at load sensitivity, I understood you to say that at some point in time you ask your customers what they see happening in the future. And I was wondering about the sensitivity of that kind of information and actually how frequently you do it. Is it worth the effort, or does it actually give you good information?
Question is about the load forecasting process where, last time we talked about, in addition to looking at economic numbers and existing data, we also talk to our largest customers. That's valuable information because of, the percentage of energy demand that our large customers represent. I mean, it's true not just for P&M, but most energy systems. There's a few customers that account for a large amount of your sales. So I think the flip side of that, if we weren't talking to them, we wouldn't be doing a good job. Yes?
Are you going to go through each of those scenario bullets?
I would like to.
So I've got a stack of questions, maybe 4 or 5, but I don't, I wanted to test them in order.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure I'm doing enough.
Okay. So at this point, we're going to go back to talking to the slide. Basically, what I did was show the stuff I know that we need to do and tried to highlight the things I've already done. We've had some discussion and feedback suggesting to me that, okay, we should go ahead and fill these out just so to be complete on that. And then I guess I owe somebody a muffin if I'm proved that we learned something more than what we know now for those. Then the next item is talking through different sensitivities that we're going to look at in the IRP. The first item is energy efficiency sensitivity. This is a standard stalwart of the IRP process. One of the resources that's on our load and resource table. It's a resource that's grown over the years. We project it will continue to grow into the future, but it's a resource that depends on our customers taking action on their own behalf. so it's not something that we have direct control over to the degree of some of the other resources. So what we will do is run sensitivities on energy efficiency that will have the effect of creating minor sensitivities around the load profiles. So as Steve described, going forward, we'll be spending 3% of sales on energy efficiency. So the paradigm of how to project energy efficiency is a little different, but the concept is the same. In the past, we would be projecting how much the energy efficiency resource would get us and then trying to guess what it would cost. Now we're going to be projecting what we're going to project what it costs and then have estimates around what we will achieve at that price. So we'll build a band around the energy efficiency and see if that affects our portfolio concepts at all. Technology breakthrough scenario, we've been kind of nibbling around at the edges on that. What I've heard today, and this is my plan going forward for that, is when we get to the next IRP meeting, and we'll talk about good dates for that, we'll propose a design for a technology breakthrough scenario, and it could very well be we're going to have more than one. The ideas that people have brought up here, and I agree with them, are we need to look at storage. I mean, we've got the advantage of actually having some good data at the moment that we're generating ourselves on what a storage facility can do. There's been a lot of good work on how best to dispatch that storage. So we should try to harvest what we're learning to define what a storage resource can do. And then the key for a technology breakthrough scenario is trying to project how far away are we today from that technology reducing in cost to the point where it would be something that we would include as a key component of our portfolio. So that's one technology breakthrough item. Another is, and there was frankly more discussion or the kind of a hotter topic 3 years ago than it is now, but the topic still exists, is what's going on with different nuclear reactor designs. So we'll look at that and we'll have at least a position or an opinion on what we think would be a reasonable thing to look at for something like a small modular nuclear reactor. Just keep in mind that when you're talking small for nuclear, it still tends to be big for B&M, so that's one of the things that we will try to put some boundaries around when we talk about that in technology breakthrough. And then was there anything else that you were thinking about or you heard today that we should include on this list for technology breakthrough? Yes, but
you mentioned storage. That I think you were thinking strictly in terms of electrical storage. There's also thermal storage in the sense of combining higher temperature storage with compound with a concentrating solar. And one of the reasons for my question earlier about the peaking plant rather than a combined cycle plant is that there have been combined cycle plants co-located with concentrated solar. So you use the thermal energy either from the combined cycle from the waste heat off the turbine or from the solar to run the steam turbine.
Okay, so the comment is that we should broaden our definition of storage, not just electrical storage, but thermal storage, and look at some different combinations of where that can be combined with solar or other steam-using technologies as a benefit. So that's a good comment. So storage would be electrical storage in the form of battery or something like that, and thermal storage. Yes, Dave?
The other thing that sort of falls in that category is underground pumped hydro. There's, I think, one project actually moving towards construction in Texas where they're using caverns, I think artificially created at 2 different levels, and pumping the water back and forth between them. And other than transmission, there's not much you see on top of the ground with that. I don't know, do you have any geologists on tap that could talk to the potential for doing that in the P&M area, particularly the TAP 48 area?
Yeah, so the suggestion is to look at a pumped hydro storage, and the twist on that I never heard is underground pumped hydro, so that's good. Yeah, it was on page 32 of Popular Science. That's an interesting thing, David. If you know any more details about that particular project, you can send them to us. We can look at it, and then we do have some geologists on staff, but I think we probably will need to reach out beyond P&M to look at something like that. But that's an interesting topic. The next bullet on here is transmission investment scenario. There's two concepts I think that are on my list that we need to think through on that, and one is what I already described as breaking the load side paradigm, which is get it to where we could build generation resources that aren't necessarily inside the load pocket. So what kind of transmission investment, or what's the smallest or most intelligent investment we could make, and then compare that to the benefit of different technologies with different siting scenarios. And then the other one is, and I'm expecting this to be something that we're going to find when we get to the last one, which, the last one was a comment we received at the September 17th meeting, is look at a higher penetration of wind on our system. Right now we're modeling a wind resource based on the bids we received in the last IRP, and it isn't included in the things we think will happen as a replacement for San Juan Generating Station, but it does show up in different scenarios as an energy resource over the life of the portfolio. So we're going to play with wind to see how low the price would have to get for us before the dynamics of when we pick that resource start changing. And then as we look at what the potential is, I think we'll find most of the wind resources on the east side of the state. For us, we've got a one dead-end line that heads out east, so we'll need to look at what the capacity capability is on that line, look at what transmission investments might be required to tap more wind to bring it onto P&M system. And then we can also broaden it to other things like the SunZia project. There's potential that subscription to that project might achieve the same goal as investing in our line. So there's a lot of work that we need to do on transmission, and frankly that was one of the things I was looking forward to doing after we got through this cycle of meetings, is sitting down with my transmission group and working through that kind of stuff. Next one, these are, for those of you who've been involved in IRT before, there's a rule. I'll stop here and ask Tom's question.
Thank you. I have two questions on transmission, you were talking about, and David Van Winkle wasn't able to be here last time or this time. He mentioned some bids that came into the utilities much lower than P&M's. So when you're talking about doing that sensitivity on where's the break even for wind coming into the portfolio and changing, that's how you're going to address David's question?
Yeah, the question we received on last Tuesday was, it was about prices for wind resources that frankly P&M's never been bid. And so one of the things we try to do with planning is stick to things we know we can achieve. So relying on a bid we haven't received as part of our resource plan probably isn't something that to me passes muster. But on the other hand, understanding what price does make sense, so that if a bid does come along that falls within that window, that's something that we need to look at. So that's our goal, is to see how low the price would have to be to move up the wind resource sooner than we're seeing it already. So anyway, does that answer your question?
It does. And then the other question, I'm trying to take notes at the same time. The other question is, do you have built into the 177 megawatt gas peaker the gas transmission that I've seen talked about from the interstate pipelines up to the Four Corners side?
Yeah, we do have an assumption for all. This is true not just for the plant that we're talking about at San Juan, but for all of the gas resources that we model that aren't on our system now. we include assumptions for transmission, hooking it up to a transmission system, and for getting a fuel supply. So in most cases, that's a generic assumption. For the case of the San Juan as a site, because we know more about that site, we have a little bit different assumptions for that. But to answer your question, yes, we do include a price to get a gas supply there and hook it to the transmission system. Okay, so next on the list, again, if you've been involved in IRP in the past, you'll know that as the IRP rule evolved, there was a process where the groups that were interested came together and decided to standardize pricing for the anticipated CO2 regulation. So far, what we've been modeling is the curves that we purchased from PACE, that those are coordinated between the gas and electric market. And we have, within those curves, we have a situation where we've got a very a very low to late appearing carbon price that's on the low end. And we also have a scenario where we have earlier occurring carbon price and it goes very high in the early end. So we felt like with those curves, we were capturing the concept that was sought after when the standardized carbon pricing were added to one of the things that's required for an IRP. So that's why we haven't done that yet. It's on the list here because we will do it. What ends up happening, I think, is that it falls between the boundaries of what we're doing with the PACE curves, but we will do that. And we'll also, we'll go high to low end, start with 0, and we'll go up to 40. And, these prices, when they originally, if you go back to what we're required to do, I think they're supposed to start in 2010 or 2008. Anyway, you're supposed to start with a price in a year gone by. So that's one of the fun aspects of this, is that we'll be modeling prices that didn't happen, but we will do that as part of our IRP. Okay, so it starts in 2010 and goes up at 2.5% per year. So I put that on there just to let people know we are going to do that. Then similar to last IRP, water is a big issue, big topic for us. And one of the things that I intend to show as we go forward, we've talked about it a lot, just haven't illustrated it, is when we're looking at total cost, there are some pieces of the puzzle that have a big impact on the total cost. Like gas fuel prices, for example, or CO2 regulation. Water is a very important thing because we all have to have it, but when you look at what it costs P&M in terms of generation, it's a small number. So how we handle that in the modeling is we think about it in terms of it's not the price that matters, it's can I have it or not that matters. So we'll pick a few ideas where water availability is restricted and throw that idea at the portfolio and see how it reacts. So that water availability sensitivity ends up being a real valuable qualitative risk analysis so that we can see just how important water resources are to individual plants. And then the last one I talked about a little bit, it stems from a comment we received 2 meetings ago, is look at high wind penetration on our system. And so we'll look at, first of all, how low the price has to go, and then we'll look at what happens to the portfolio if we add more than the 300 megawatts that we already have in our plan in the future. And so we'll have to look at that not just in terms of cost, which I already described, but that's more of a reliability question. And where it shows up in reliability is, do we also have sufficient balancing resources to make this happen in terms of matching supply and demand? Tom, you have another question?
Yeah. Are you saying that what additional scenarios P&M is going to run for an open question and we'll keep discussing over the future meeting?
What I'm saying is I'm promising to run these. And what I'm also saying is I'm listening to you.
Okay.
So if you've got some ideas, I will adjust. What I'm not saying is we're going to run absolutely every scenario sensitivity. So I don't want to create that expectation.
Well, we've already talked about full prices. It's something to look at. How are SNCR prices treated? Where are they and what information can you give us?
SNCR prices, we're pretty far along in the design and bid process in terms of what that technology costs at San Juan. So how are they included is whenever we're running one of these scenarios where we're following the Sept, we include the cost of SNCR installation on the 2 units at San Juan that don't get shut down.
When are we going to get what those numbers are? When are we going to
Well, I'm thinking because there's a lot of processes going on, I can promise you'll see them by December. I can go through the stuff we've produced to date. I wouldn't be surprised if it's already out there. So whether you get it formally through me in the IRP process or some other way, we can point you to where those numbers are.
And we haven't, 2 more. We haven't talked much about the assumptions behind distributed generation. We've got one table that shows PNM's participation in the DG program through 2013, and then we've got this load and resource table, which has some forecasts on it. So can you explain DG today or another time and give us a little more information about that forecast?
Yeah, that's a good point. That is something we do need to talk about some more. And it's not just DG, but other resources that we're purchasing. We also need to look at over that 20-year horizon. For example, the Valencia PPA expires, so we need to look at that. So I think that's a good agenda item for our next meeting is where we at with DG resource. This sheet that we handed out, like I said, was just a snapshot. So what it includes is existing and proposed things. So you'll see that the incremental customer-sited PV doesn't grow on here after we get past our approved program. So I don't think that's necessarily the assumption that we'll stick with through IRP, because no matter what we assume, I would assume that people will continue to add PV to their system.
It might be an interesting thing to be sensitive now. The last question then was treating the supply side resource capital costs as an expected value or fixed data point or input value to the model as opposed to looking at scenarios, particularly solar with its price trajectory downward. I'm wondering if you're open to looking at scenarios around that total planned cost number instead of just the point of information.
So the question is if we're open to looking at sensitivity around capital costs for different technology. My answer to that is we've already done it, so the answer is yes. We did look at the sensitivity around the fixed or the single axis solar tracking before we got to the recommendation that we showed last Tuesday. And then we've already talked about how we will do that for the wind resource also. So the answer to that is yes. I think the better question is wind, solar, we're doing that. Are there other resources that you believe aren't as well enough developed yet? And I guess another example of what we've already talked about that's on our list is storage. So that's the list I think we've built today, and we'll continue to look at that going forward. But yeah, the answer is yes. Dave?
Yes, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but do you have a price, dollars per eagle? We're going to talk about this risk factor, like CO2 is something that might come along. Eagles are a protected species, and there are 83 of them killed by wind turbines this year.
Yeah, so the question was described as tongue-in-cheek about price associated with wind farms and raptor mortality. So anyway, no, we don't include that in our process, and I don't have a good way to do that. So, but it doesn't mean. I mean, I think that falls into the bucket that we talked about the last meeting in terms of externalities. So we address them when we can quantify them. Yes, Adina.
This is my first IRP process, and where does smart grid come into this?
Smart grid is something we'll need to look at in terms of technology breakthrough. We've looked at smart grid the last couple IRPs. One of the difficulties is it's a real broad term for lots of stuff. And frankly, it tends to be kind of an enabling technology, not something that meets the supply-demand balance. So we will, when we do that technology breakthrough, we will look at elements that are typically viewed as smart grid elements. What I expect will happen is when we're talking about things like storage, implicit in the storage will be some form of a smart grid hookup. Yes.
Curiosity, it might be a little bit off topic. Innovate on things like storage. Is the technology packed with PNN and can that be a point that comes out of the utility? And then when PNN innovates and does it well, is it financial benefit?
The question is kind of a broad question about the value to P&M for innovating on technology. I think in the example that was used as the Prosperity storage facility, I think the answer to that totally depends on what the device is. I can think of two examples. One, the Prosperity site, that was a DOE demonstration project. So the goal of that was to help advance the science. And really the innovation of that project was hooking up three things that everybody already knows exist. So there's not much that I would expect is patentable or could be revenue generating for that. On the other end of the spectrum, P&M did develop SF6, I think I've got that right. The sulfur hexafluoride is a gas that is occasionally emitted from some elements of the transmission system, and it has an extremely high greenhouse gas potential. So it's emitted in very small quantities, but because of its greenhouse gas potential, you kind of want to know if you're emitting it. So anyway, P&M invented a detector for that and attempted to sell that detector on the market. And so, yeah, if we can innovate and can profit from it, we will. Does that happen with absolutely every instance of innovation? No. Okay. So I really appreciate the comments we've received on this. This was what I thought would be a very valuable discussion. What will happen out of this is we'll listen to what we've heard, rebuild this sheet, and share it out through the process. And so what that leads me to is let's talk about the rest of the process. So this is just what's going on right now is, these 2 weeks have been very valuable to the IRP team. We got a lot of information out there. We got a lot of high quality comment and discussion back. So we kind of need to sit there and digest what we've heard and put things together. So we'll be doing that next week. We also have a whole list of model runs queued up that we'll be running. So we'll be doing that. And at the same time we're doing that, we're also working on issuing our next renewable energy RFP. So we'll put that out on the street, and we'll get bids back on that early next year. So that'll be soon enough to help us think about our action plan before we file. I'm proposing that the next meeting will be in November, because I think with the amount of work that we need to do before we get to the next meeting, it'll take about 4 weeks to do the work, and in a couple of weeks we'd like to get it in your hands in advance of the meeting. You have some time to digest and look at it. one of the design things we did this year was we just felt like it was tough to ask people to show up once a month for 8 hours, so we thought it was easier for folks to take a half a day and show up for half a day. So my concept for November would be keep the same kind of meeting schedule or process where we'll do a half a day meeting. I originally was thinking maybe we'll have one half a day in November, but I think based on the quality and quantity of what it is that we still want to do, it would probably be helpful to have a day where we present information, then you'll have a little bit of time to think about it, and then come back together and have a feedback session that's pretty close in time to the data dump. So what I would propose is that we do 2 days in November for the IRP, and we'll talk about dates for that. And then the next big data dump that will be received is somewhere in December PM. We'll be filing part of the replacement plan for the San Juan generating station. So those will be the type of resources that we have at hand now. I mean, one of the key features of it is we have to file for abandonment of the 2 units because they're currently providing necessary service to our customers. So that's part of the regulatory compact is we need to, before we remove something that is part of the deal, we need to ask permission for the PRC. So that's the key feature of the December filing. I would anticipate that included in that would be something like the Palo Verde 3 replacement. The type of thing that won't be in there will be the solar resource, because we want to get the bid so that when we propose that, it will be defined in terms of cost and schedule. And then the other thing that won't be in there would be this gas peaking plant, because similar to solar, we want to run some kind of procurement process to make sure we have that resource defined and nailed down. But we will be talking about the context of whatever we do ask for in December, we'll be talking about it in a larger context, much like we've been doing here at the IRP meeting. So that's what we're doing next. The next slide, I think I had, when I'm looking at my calendar and the calendar for this room and think about holidays and PRC meetings and that type of thing, 2 dates that seemed like possibilities were Friday, November 15th and Tuesday, November 19th. So I ask that collectively look at your calendars, and if you see something big that I'm not seeing when I'm looking at calendars that conflicts with those dates, let me know. We can adjust that. The other thing that's true about just the number of people that are involved, we're not going to be able to hit everybody's calendar perfectly, so we'll try to avoid big events. But I apologize that some of you might not be able to attend those 2 days. And then another just thing for this group to be aware of, you've been here, so you've lived it, but next Friday, October 4th, we're going to do a recap session of these 3 days in Santa Fe. The location is the NMPRC building. That's the old PERA building near the state capitol. The meeting will be at 8:30 in the morning in the 2nd floor auditorium. That's called Apadaga Hall. So we'll send that note out through the email distribution list. I don't expect to be breaking any ground in that meeting that we haven't already covered in these 3 meetings. I'll be using the slides from that and just providing kind of a status update or reiterating what we've talked about here, but then again asking for public advisory comments. So everyone obviously is welcome to attend that meeting, and if you know folks like are in Santa Fe and haven't been able to make it to Albuquerque, that's an opportunity for them to show up and hear what we're saying about IRP. So those are the dates for future meetings in IRP. I'm not going to ask for any kind of show of hands or something on dates at the moment, because that can be chaos. But so send me a note if you look at your calendar and say, hey, there's a Lobo football game or something that you're not. Try to keep it to only the most important items. And last slide, I just thought was kind of interesting at this point in the process, and we've added names to this list today. Kind of a congratulations to yourselves. I mean, first of all, just sincerely, these meetings have been very valuable for PNM, and the value of it's derived by the attitude and the quality and the thoughtfulness that you brought into this room. We've heard a lot of good comments. I think we've had a good discussion. We are very early in the process. You know, we don't file till next summer. So when we look at where we're at right now in the process and where we're at going forward. So anyway, I just wanted to put this up as kind of a shout out to the people who had attended the meetings up to today. And we'll continue to build this list as we go on. So thank you is my final comment here. But
Thank you. One more question.
So I got a question, Bob.
You mentioned in December you're going to go to the PRC.
Yep.
And if I understood it correctly, you're going to go with the revised Sept, including Palo Verde. So
that's what we expect right now.
In this IRP process, that Palo Verde's, that's the only viable option.
It's not a foregone conclusion. It's the option that has proven to be the best choice.
So a variation of that is not a consideration within this IRP. What I'm trying to understand is what it is we're going to be looking at going forward. And if there's already a set plan in place, let's just say this is the plan, and we can only look at variations in this area.
So the concept is, what will IRP be looking at going forward if we're filing replacement options for San Juan in December? First point is IRP is a 20-year planning horizon. So if having experience working through these type of problems and questions, the near term, you don't have as many options. So between now and retirement at San Juan Generating Station is, for the electric industry, it might not feel like it for everybody, but for how long it takes to grow and change things on the generation resource portfolio, that's a pretty near event. So that's the thing that, again, and we've presented it because we've done a lot of work and pushed it around quite a bit. So the things that we have presented, we feel absolutely confident in. For the rest of IRP, we're going to be looking at what happens from 2018 on. And so that's a long period of time. And it will affect our 4-year action plan for the results, because we'll be building around our existing portfolio of resources and what we expect to file for that one question, which is what's the best mix to replace San Juan Generating Station. So IRP, from my point of view, is not a foregone conclusion. The thing that we did in IRP to try to do two things. One is build a process that made it easier to understand how we think about things and how we look at it, is we looked at one near-term question, which was replacement of San Juan capacity. And then we're going to use the information that we have developed within IRP as a basis for the filing we're going to make in December. So, I mean, overall, in 3 years from now, I think I'd like to do IRP the same way again, even though we're not going to have this topic. 3 years from now, I think it has served us, at least through these first few meetings, it served us really well to have something to examine right off the bat. So 3 years from now, we'll pick another topic, and we'll do the same thing, where we'll start IRP and lock in on something in the near term and say, hey, this is how the process works. This is a good recommendation for one leg of my 20-year plan, and then build from there going forward. Do we have any more questions? Sorry, I threw the thank you curtain down before you had asked your questions, but it's not my intention to stifle comment.
What happens if the EPA is going to promulgate regulations on CO2 for existing plants, right? Sometime in the next 2 or 3 years, I guess. What if they come down with a limit that's less than your emissions on the remaining units at San Juan Generating Station?
That's why we use prices to model the future. Because, I mean, the question, if you're still hanging in on the web, was, EPA is coming out with regulations that will address CO2 emissions from existing plants. I mean, there was just recent activity around that last week. But where we're at in the rulemaking process, there's just a bunch of things we don't know about how that will exactly play out over time. So what we do know is it's reasonable to anticipate CO2 emissions will be regulated not just from new plants but existing. So the approach that we've chosen is to say that if I emit CO2 emissions, that makes my portfolio more expensive. And so we're looking at a range of CO2 prices, because it could be that the regulation manifests itself just in terms of when you build something new, it costs more money than what we're modeling right now. Or it could be some of the things that we're modeling right now, you're not allowed to build in the future. So we just don't know. So that's how we've chosen to address that risk, is just by saying the impact will be if I do something that emits CO2, things get more expensive. And then we're looking at a wide range of prices, because some of the items, like, for example, the solar that we're talking about, isn't all that sensitive to future CO2 prices. So when we get things where we've got a situation where it makes sense over the full range of CO2 gets super expensive to there is no cost for CO2, we feel better that that's a good step to take. Well, thanks again. Thank you. And again, we'll keep communicating through the interwebs. So see you again in November or next Friday.